Chapter 6. Fevered Truths. Holy Saturday dawned with lavender streaks across the eastern sky, the faintest whisper of gold promising resurrection after darkness. For the townsfolk of Redemption Springs huddled at the mine entrance through the long night vigil, that dawn carried special significance. Word had filtered up from below that all 8 trapped miners lived, though some, Harold Miller among them, had sustained serious injuries. Susan had not left her post once during the night. She'd sent Abigail home with Mrs. Peabody, who had, for once, offered help without commentary. Then Susan had settled on an upturned crate near the mine entrance, a borrowed shawl pulled tight against the night chill, refusing all suggestions that she seek rest. "I'll rest when they're above ground," she'd replied, her voice hoarse but determined. By her reckoning, Josiah had been below for nearly 14 hours. 14 hours in darkness, in fouled air, in constant danger. Her hands had grown raw from wringing and her knees ached from frequent prayer, but she maintained her vigil without complaint. When the first shout went up, "They're coming out!" Susan rose on trembling legs. The gathered crowd pressed forward, necks craning for a glimpse of loved ones. Miners' wives clutched each other's hands. Children, bleary-eyed from the overnight wait, wiggled through the press of adults for better vantage. The first stretcher emerged into the pale dawn light. Susan's breath caught in her throat as she recognized her uncle's still form. His face was ashen beneath coal dust and dried blood, his breathing shallow. But he lived. "Uncle Harold!" she cried, rushing forward as 2 men carried the stretcher toward the doctor's makeshift treatment area. Harold's eyelids fluttered at the sound of her voice. "Susan?" he rasped. "That you, girl?" "It's me." She clasped his hand, mindful of the splint on his forearm. "I'm here. Abigail?" "Safe, with Mrs. Peabody," Susan assured him, keeping pace with the stretcher bearers. "She's been praying for you all night." A ghost of a smile touched Harold's cracked lips. "Good girl." At the treatment area, Susan reluctantly stepped back to allow the doctor access. More miners were emerging now, some walking with assistants, others carried on stretchers. The crowd's jubilation swelled with each man brought safely into the light. Easter's promise of redemption seemed embodied in each soot-streaked face. Susan scanned the mine entrance anxiously. Where was Josiah? When he finally appeared, supported by Bill Thompson on one side and another miner on the other, Susan felt her heart constrict. Josiah's tall frame was stooped with exhaustion. His face, barely recognizable beneath layers of coal dust, looked hollow-cheeked and dangerously pale in the strengthening daylight. But his eyes, those intense blue eyes that had captured her attention from her first Sunday in Redemption Springs, searched the crowd until they found her. Something in his gaze made her breath catch. Despite his obvious exhaustion, despite the physical devastation of 14 hours below ground, there was a light in Josiah Fletcher's eyes that hadn't been there before. A clarity. A certainty. Before she could analyze what it meant, her feet were carrying her forward. She weaved through the celebrating townsfolk, barely registering their joyful exclamations. In that moment, all the awkwardness of the past week evaporated. All the mortification of her misinterpreted journal reading, all the careful distance she'd maintained, gone, swept away by the torrent of relief washing through her. "Josiah," she called, her voice breaking. "Thank God!" He straightened slightly at the sound of her voice, a smile breaking through the grime on his face. "Susan!" She reached him, just as Bill Thompson and the other miner eased their support, apparently satisfied Josiah could stand on his own. Without conscious thought, Susan threw her arms around her uncle's rescuer, embracing him with all the pent-up worry of the long night. "You brought them out," she whispered against his ruined shirt. "You brought them all out." Josiah's arms encircled her, trembling with exhaustion but surprisingly strong. For a heartbeat they stood locked together, oblivious to the celebrating chaos around them. Susan could feel his heart hammering against her cheek, could smell coal dust and sweat, and something uniquely Josiah beneath it all. When she pulled back slightly to look up at him, his eyes held hers with an intensity that stole her breath. "I had something worth coming back for," he said quietly, the words meant for her alone. Susan felt heat rush to her cheeks. Before she could formulate a reply, Josiah's expression changed abruptly. His features slackened, eyes rolling backward as his knees buckled. "Josiah!" Susan cried, trying to support his weight as he collapsed. Bill Thompson lunged forward, catching the preacher before he hit the ground. "Doc!" he bellowed over the crowd. "Need help here?" Dr. Wilson appeared as if conjured, his sleeves stained with the blood of miners he'd already treated. He knelt beside Josiah, who lay unconscious in the dirt, and pressed experienced fingers to the pulse point at his throat. "Bad air," the doctor pronounced grimly. "It can have delayed effects. Bill, help me get him to my office." "No," Susan spoke before she'd fully formed the thought. "Take him to the parsonage. It's closer and Thomas is there." Dr. Wilson hesitated only briefly before nodding. "The parsonage, then. But he'll need round-the-clock care. Fevers often follow exposure to mine gases." "I'll stay with him," Susan said, her voice steady with newfound purpose. "I've nursed before." As several men fashioned a makeshift stretcher, Susan glanced toward the doctor's treatment area where her Uncle Harold was receiving attention. She was torn between two responsibilities, two bedsides where she was needed. Mrs. Peabody appeared at her elbow as if sensing her dilemma. The older woman's customary pinched expression had softened overnight into something approaching compassion. "I'll see to your uncle," she offered gruffly. "Got plenty of experience with mining injuries from when Mr. Peabody worked the claims." Susan blinked in surprise. "But Abigail—" "The child's fine at my house. My Martha's keeping her occupied with Easter preparations." Mrs. Peabody sniffed. "You tend to the preacher. Lord knows Thomas needs a woman's touch in that household." The implied approval in Mrs. Peabody's tone, from the church's most notorious gossip, no less, threatened to bring tears to Susan's exhausted eyes. She could only nod gratefully as the men lifted Josiah onto the hastily constructed stretcher and began the solemn procession toward the parsonage. "Is Papa going to heaven like Mama did?" Thomas' small voice, pitched high with worry, pierced Susan's concentration as she wrung out another cool cloth for Josiah's forehead. The boy had barely left her side in the 24 hours since his father had been carried, unconscious, into the parsonage's modest bedroom. Susan set down her basin and knelt to Thomas's level, meeting his fearful gaze directly. "No, sweetheart, your papa is very sick from the bad air in the mine, but Dr. Wilson says he's strong. He's fighting to get better." Thomas's lower lip trembled. "Promise?" Susan hesitated. She'd seen enough sickness to know better than to make promises only God could keep. Yet looking into those trusting blue eyes, so like his father's, she couldn't bear to introduce doubt. "I promise to stay right here and help him fight," she said carefully. "And we'll pray together, just like your papa taught you. Would that help?" The child nodded solemnly. He climbed onto the chair beside his father's bed and folded his hands with unpracticed reverence. "Dear God," he began without preamble, "please make Papa better, quick, because Easter's coming and he's supposed to tell the resurrection story at church, and Miss Susan is tired because she's been sitting up all night, and I miss him something awful. Amen." Susan swallowed against the lump in her throat. "That was a fine prayer, Thomas." The boy looked at his father's still form, then back to Susan, his expression brightening slightly. "Can I help you take care of him, like you helped Abigail when she had the fever?" "I'd be grateful for the help," Susan replied, seizing the opportunity to give the child purpose. "Could you fetch fresh water from the pump? And perhaps afterward you could help me tidy up the kitchen?" Thomas scrambled from the chair, eager for the assignment. "I'll be quick as lightning." As the boy's footsteps receded down the hallway, Susan turned her attention back to Josiah. His fever had risen steadily through the night, bringing with it restless muttering and occasional coughing fits that left him gasping for breath. Dr. Wilson had visited twice, prescribing willow bark tea for the fever and a mustard plaster for his labored lung. The body must purge the mine gases, the doctor had explained. The fever is part of that process. Keep him cool, keep him hydrated if you can manage it, and pray. Susan had done all three with methodical determination. She'd brewed the bitter tea, spooning it between Josiah's cracked lips when he was lucid enough to swallow. She'd changed his sweat-soaked nightshirt, averting her eyes with maidenly propriety while managing the task with a nurse's efficiency. She'd whispered prayers without ceasing, even as she transformed the bachelor household with quiet purpose. The parsonage kitchen, clearly the domain of a man with limited domestic inclinations, had required particular attention. While Josiah slept fitfully, Susan had scrubbed surfaces neglected for too long, organized mismatched dishes, and brought order to cupboards whose contents suggested hurried meal preparations focused on sustenance rather than enjoyment. Thomas had shadowed her throughout, eager to show her where things belonged, proudly explaining his father's system for managing household tasks around sermon writing and pastoral duties. Papa says a man must keep a good Christian home, even without a lady to help, he'd informed her with adorable solemnity, as he demonstrated how they said grace before their simple meals. Now, as Susan adjusted the cool cloth on Josiah's burning forehead, she allowed herself a moment to study his face unobserved. Even in illness, with features drawn tight by fever, Josiah Fletcher possessed a quiet dignity. His dark hair, usually neatly combed for church, curled damply against his temples. His beard, typically well-trimmed, showed several days' additional growth. Beneath closed eyelids, his eyes moved rapidly, suggesting dreams. Or perhaps delirium. "Josiah," she murmured, allowing herself the intimacy of his given name. "You must fight this. Thomas needs you. The town needs you." She hesitated, then whispered even more softly, "I need you." The admission, spoken aloud for the first time even in this private moment, sent a flush of warmth through her chest. How unexpected life's turnings could be! 6 weeks ago, she'd arrived in Redemption Springs a widow with few prospects beyond her uncle's charity. She'd come west seeking nothing more than shelter and a fresh start for Abigail. She certainly hadn't come looking for a second chance at love, especially not with a preacher still devoted to his dead wife's memory. Yet here she sat, maintaining vigil at Josiah Fletcher's bedside, her heart traitorously full of feelings she'd believed forever buried in a Pennsylvania mining town. A knock at the front door interrupted her reverie. Rising stiffly from her chair, Susan tucked the blanket more securely around Josiah's shoulders before making her way down the narrow hallway. Thomas had already reached the door and was peeking through the curtained window beside it. "It's Mrs. Wilson with a basket," he announced, and Mrs. Davenport behind her with another one. Susan smoothed her rumpled skirts and tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear before opening the door. On the porch stood not just the doctor's wife and Mrs. Davenport, but a delegation of church ladies, each bearing covered dishes or baskets. "We've come to help," Mrs. Wilson announced without preamble, her no-nonsense manner reminiscent of her husband's. "Can't have you nursing our preacher and trying to cook and clean as well." "We've organized a rotation," added Mrs. Davenport, a plump, cheerful woman whose 5 children kept her perpetually in motion. "Each family will provide a meal. The younger women will come by to help with laundry and housekeeping." Susan felt momentarily overwhelmed by the unexpected support. "That's incredibly kind, but I couldn't impose—" "Nonsense," interrupted Mrs. Blakely, the milliner's wife. "Reverend Fletcher has seen us all through hard times. Sitting with the sick is what neighbors do." She peered over Susan's shoulder into the parsonage. "Besides, Easter's nearly upon us. If the good Lord could rise from the grave, surely our preacher can rise from his sickbed with a little help from his flock." Thomas bounced excitedly beside Susan. "Papa's gonna get better, 'cause Miss Susan promised to help him fight." The women exchanged knowing glances that made Susan's cheeks warm. Mrs. Wilson took charge, ushering the others into the small parlor with their offering. "Thomas, dear, show us to the kitchen," the doctor's wife instructed. "Miss Hawkins, you go back to the patient. You look dead on your feet, if you'll pardon my saying so." Susan recognized the futility of protest. With a grateful nod, she retreated to Josiah's bedside, while the determined ladies took command of the household. Soon the aroma of fresh bread and chicken soup wafted through the previously musty parsonage. The subtle rustling of brooms and the soft clink of dishes being organized created a homey symphony of sound. Thomas flitted between the kitchen and bedroom, bringing Susan reports of the ladies' activities with wide-eyed amazement. "Mrs. Davenport brought 3 different pies," he marveled, "and Mrs. Blakely fixed my church trousers where they tore on the fence." Susan smiled at his excitement. For a child raised in a household missing a mother's touch, the sudden influx of maternal energy must seem miraculous indeed. Later, as afternoon shadows lengthened across the bedroom floor, Mrs. Wilson brought Susan a cup of fragrant tea and a plate of buttered bread. You need to keep up your strength, the doctor's wife insisted. John says the crisis should pass by tomorrow if the fever breaks tonight. And if it doesn't? Susan couldn't help asking. Mrs. Wilson's expression softened. Then we pray harder. She glanced at Josiah's still form, then back to Susan. He's a good man, our preacher. Took Sarah's passing hard. Too hard, some might say. Shut himself off except for Thomas and his congregation. Susan sipped her tea, uncertain how to respond to this oblique reference to Josiah's emotional state. Mrs. Wilson seemed to require no answer. First time I've seen light in his eyes since she died was when you and your girl arrived in town. She patted Susan's hand. Whatever happens, remember that. After the doctor's wife departed, Susan sat lost in thought, turning the woman's words over in her mind. Had there truly been a change in Josiah since her arrival? She'd been too focused on establishing herself in a new town, on helping Abigail adjust, to notice any particular attention from the handsome preacher. Until, of course, that mortifying incident with his journal, which had turned out to be old letters to his dead wife, not declarations of new love for her. A soft moan from the bed drew her attention. Josiah stirred restlessly, his head turning from side to side as if seeking relief from invisible torments. Susan set aside her tea and leaned forward, pressing a fresh cloth to his forehead. Shh, she soothed. You're safe now. You're home. Josiah's eyes fluttered open, though Susan could tell immediately that fever clouds still veiled his awareness. Sarah? He whispered hoarsely. The name sent a pang through Susan's chest, but she kept her voice steady. No, Josiah, it's Susan Hawkins. He blinked slowly, seeming to process this information through the haze of fever. Suzanne, he repeated, his parched lips attempting a smile. You stayed. Of course I stayed, she murmured, helping him sip water from a nearby glass. You brought my uncle safely from that mine. How could I do less for you? Josiah's gaze wandered the room before settling on her face again with surprising intensity. In the darkness, he said, the words halting but clear, I saw truth. Susan leaned closer, uncertain if this was fever talk or lucidity. What truth, Josiah? His hand emerged from beneath the blanket, surprisingly strong as it sought and found hers. That love isn't finite, doesn't run out. He swallowed with visible effort. Sarah would want Thomas to have a mother, want me to live again. Susan's heart thundered in her chest. Was this delirium speaking? Or had the mind's darkness indeed revealed something to the man before her? Before she could respond, Josiah's eyes drifted closed again, his breathing settling into the rhythm of sleep. His hand, however, remained firmly clasped around hers, as if even unconsciousness couldn't persuade him to release this newfound connection. Outside the bedroom window, a robin trilled the promise of spring. Inside, Susan Hawkins kept her vigil, holding the hand of a fever-stricken preacher who might, just might, be finding his way back to life in more ways than one. Night settled over Redemption Springs like a prayer shawl, wrapping the town in reverent darkness. The Saturday before Easter, Holy Saturday, brought with it a hush that seemed fitting for a community suspended between tragedy and salvation. 8 miners had emerged alive from what could have been their tomb. Now the town held its collective breath, waiting to see if their beloved preacher would recover from his sacrifice. In the parsonage, Susan trimmed the lamp as darkness deepened outside. The flame cast wavering shadows across Josiah's face, highlighting the feverish flush on his cheeks. Despite cool compresses and willow bark tea administered faithfully throughout the day, his temperature had climbed steadily as evening approached. Dr. Wilson, making his 3rd visit since dawn, had frowned over Josiah's labored breathing. The fever's fighting the mine gases, he'd explained, packing his bag after examining his patient. It often gets worse before it breaks. This night will likely be the crisis point. And if the fever doesn't break? Susan had asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The doctor's weathered face had grown solemn. Then we prepare for the worst, Miss Hawkins. But Josiah Fletcher is strong, and he has much to live for. His gaze had flickered meaningfully toward Thomas, who dozed in a chair by the window, exhausted from worry and excitement. Now, as the mantel clock ticked away the minutes of this interminable night, Susan adjusted the quilt covering Josiah's restless form. Thomas had finally been persuaded to sleep in his own bed, after extracting a solemn promise that Susan would wake him if his father showed any sign of improvement. "Your papa needs you rested and strong," she'd told him. Smoothing his cowlick with gentle fingers, "Tomorrow's Easter Sunday. We want you bright-eyed to celebrate whatever happens." Mrs. Peabody had brought Abigail to visit briefly that afternoon, reporting that Harold was resting comfortably at the doctor's house with a concussion and broken arm, but no life-threatening injuries. The reunion with her daughter had bolstered Susan's spirits, though she'd noted with concern the dark circles beneath Abigail's eyes. "She's been having nightmares again," Mrs. Peabody had confided, while Abigail showed Thomas her new hair ribbons for Easter, calling out for her father. "The mine accident stirred up old memories, I reckon." Susan had hugged her daughter extra tight before sending her back to the Peabody household with promises to be reunited soon. "Be a good helper for Mrs. Peabody," she'd instructed, "and say your prayers for Reverend Fletcher." Abigail had nodded solemnly. "I already asked Jesus to make him better, just like he's going to rise on Easter." Now, alone with her feverish patient, Susan fought her own exhaustion. 2 nights without proper sleep had left her lightheaded, her limbs leaden with fatigue. She forced herself to stand, to pace the small bedroom, to splash cold water on her face from the basin. "You mustn't fall asleep," she admonished herself. "Not tonight." A low moan from the bed drew her attention. Josiah's head tossed against the pillows, his brow furrowed in apparent distress. Susan hurried to his side, pressing a fresh cloth to his forehead. "Easy now," she murmured. "You're safe." His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and bright with fever. "Sarah?" he called, the name a hoarse plea. "Sarah, where are you?" The familiar pang struck Susan's heart, but she kept her voice steady. "It's Susan, Josiah. Sarah isn't here." His gaze wandered the room before settling on her face without recognition. "The mine," he muttered. "Dark, can't breathe." "You're not in the mine anymore," Susan assured him, taking his hand between both of hers. "You're home. You rescued everyone. Harold, all the others, they're safe because of you." Josiah's fingers tightened around hers with surprising strength. "I saw her," he whispered. "In the darkness. Sarah was there." Susan swallowed hard. "Was she—" He nodded, the movement jerky and uncoordinated. "She looked peaceful, beautiful." His voice cracked on the last word. "Told me to let go. Said I was holding on too tight." Despite herself, Susan leaned closer. "Holding on to what, Josiah?" "Grief." The word emerged, clear and distinct, as if pushed through the fever haze by sheer force of will. "Been wearing it like a badge of honor. My faithfulness to her memory." Susan's heart hammered against her ribs. This was too intimate, too personal, the ravings of a man caught between consciousness and delirium. She ought to soothe him, redirect him to calmer thoughts. Instead, she found herself hanging on his every disjointed word. "You loved her very much," she said softly. Josiah's gaze drifted toward the ceiling. Do? He frowned, struggling with the tenses. "But she's gone. Been gone, and Thomas needs—" A fit of coughing interrupted him, his body convulsing with the effort. Susan helped him sit forward, supporting his weight against her shoulder as she patted his back. When the spasm passed, she eased him back against the pillows, offering a sip of water. "Don't talk anymore," she urged. "Save your strength." But Josiah seemed driven by some inner compulsion to speak, as if the fever had broken down barriers long maintained. "I saw you," he continued, his gaze now fixed on her face with unnerving intensity. "That first Sunday, sitting with Harold. Thought, how fine you looked, how dignified in your grief." Susan felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Josiah, you're feverish. You should rest." Felt guilty, he pressed on, ignoring her suggestion, for noticing, for wondering about your smile. Felt like betraying her. A floorboard creaked near the doorway. Susan glanced up, startled to see Abigail standing there in her nightgown, a shawl wrapped around her thin shoulders. The child's eyes were wide, taking in the scene before her. "Abigail, "What are you doing here?" Susan asked, torn between concern for her daughter and awareness of Josiah's vulnerable state. "Mrs. Peabody's asleep." Abigail took a tentative step into the room. "I wanted to see if Reverend Fletcher was better yet. The back door wasn't locked." Before Susan could scold her for wandering alone at night, Josiah's voice drew her attention back to the bed. "When I read to the children," he murmured, continuing his feverish monologue, "I watch how you listen, too. Like you're hungry for the words." His hand sought hers again. "And when you helped during the flood, so capable, so kind." "Josiah, please," Susan whispered, acutely aware of Abigail's presence. "You need to rest." "Afraid," he admitted, his voice dropping so low she had to lean closer to hear. "Afraid of feeling again, of wanting, of disappointing her memory." "You could never do that," Susan assured him, unable to help herself. A ghost of a smile touched his cracked lips. "That's what she said, in the darkness." His eyes began to droop, the burst of fevered energy clearly waning. "Said Thomas deserves happiness. Said I do too." His fingers tightened around hers one last time before going slack. "Said maybe you do as well." With that, Josiah Fletcher slipped back into unconsciousness, his breathing ragged but steady. Susan sat motionless beside him, her mind reeling from his disjointed confessions. How much was delirium, and how much genuine sentiment, and how much dare she hope might be remembered when the fever broke? A small hand touched her arm, making her start. Abigail had approached silently, her face solemn in the lamplight. "Is he talking to angels?" the child asked, her voice hushed with wonder rather than fear. Susan gathered her daughter close, inhaling the familiar scent of soap and little girl that somehow centered her. "No, sweetheart. The fever makes him confused. He's dreaming with his eyes open." Abigail considered this, her gaze traveling over Josiah's restless form. He was talking about his wife, the one who died. Yes. Susan stroked her daughter's hair, uncertain how much the child had understood of Josiah's ramblings. "And about you," Abigail added with a child's directness. "He likes you, doesn't he? Like Pa liked you." Susan felt heat flood her cheeks. "It's not that simple, Abigail. Grown-up feelings are complicated." "Because his wife died? Like Pa died?" "Yes, partly that." Susan sighed, wondering how to explain the nuances of adult grief and guilt to an 8-year-old. "When you love someone very much, and then they're gone, it's hard to imagine loving anyone else. It can feel disloyal." Abigail's brow furrowed in thought. "But Pa wouldn't want you to be lonely." The simple truth of this statement caught Susan off guard. Out of the mouths of babes, indeed. "No," she agreed softly. "I don't suppose he would." A sudden violent shiver ran through Josiah's frame, drawing their attention. Susan pressed a hand to his forehead, alarmed at the heat radiating from his skin. "Abigail, run to the kitchen and bring me the basin of cool water from the pump," she instructed, "then fetch a clean cloth from the drawer." As her daughter scurried to comply, Susan studied Josiah's face, noting the hectic spots of color on his cheeks, the rapid pulse visible at his throat. The fever was reaching its peak, the crisis Dr. Wilson had warned of. The next few hours would determine whether Josiah Fletcher would live to see Easter morning, or whether Thomas would become a full orphan before his 5th birthday. "Please, Lord," Susan whispered, clasping Josiah's limp hand between her own. "Not this man, not this child. They've lost enough already." Abigail returned with the requested items, setting them carefully on the bedside table. Without being asked, she pulled a chair to the opposite side of the bed and perched on it, her small face serious. "I'll help you watch over him, Mama," she declared. "2 pairs of eyes are better than 1. Susan might have sent her daughter back to the Peabody house, back to the safety of her bed, but something in Abigail's determined expression stopped her. The child had already faced death once, had already weathered the storm of losing a father. Perhaps bearing witness to this vigil was, in some way Susan couldn't fully comprehend, necessary for her. "Very well," she agreed, dipping a cloth into the cool water, "but only for a little while. Then I'm taking you back to Mrs. Peabody's." Together, mother and daughter maintained their watch, as Josiah's fever raged through the darkest hours of the night. They bathed his face and hands with cool water, spooned willow bark tea between his lips when he was conscious enough to swallow, and whispered prayers into the hushed darkness of the parsonage. And all the while, Abigail's solemn eyes absorbed everything. Her mother's gentle ministrations, Josiah's restless movements, the unspoken current of emotion that seemed to fill the small bedroom like a tangible presence. Dawn broke on Easter Sunday with jubilant clarity, sunlight streaming through the parsonage windows as if determined to banish every shadow. Birds sang with almost indecent enthusiasm outside, heralding resurrection morning with nature's own hallelujah chorus. Susan, dozing in the bedside chair after returning from escorting Abigail back to the Peabody household, jerked awake at the sound of the front door opening. Footsteps, small, hurrying ones, pattered down the hallway toward the bedroom. Thomas appeared in the doorway, still in his nightshirt, his hair standing on end. "Miss Susan, is Papa better? It's Easter!" Before she could answer, a second set of footsteps followed. Mrs. Peabody, surprisingly, with Abigail at her side. The older woman wore her Sunday best already, complete with a formidable hat adorned with silk flowers. "The child insisted on coming first thing," Mrs. Peabody explained with an uncharacteristic lack of disapproval. "Said she needed to be here for Easter morning." She glanced toward the bed. "How fares our preacher?" Susan turned toward Josiah, realizing with a start that she hadn't checked on him since dozing off. He lay still, too still, and for a heart-stopping moment she feared the worst. Then she noticed the difference. The hectic flush had faded from his cheeks. His breathing, while still labored, had lost the desperate quality of the night before. When she laid a tentative hand on his forehead, the skin felt merely warm, not blazing hot. "The fever's broken," she announced, relief making her voice unsteady. "Sometime in the night it broke," Mrs. Peabody nodded briskly, as if she'd never doubted the outcome. "The Lord knows we need our preacher, especially on Easter morning." She ushered Thomas toward the kitchen. "Come along, young man. Let's see about breakfast while your father rests." To Susan's surprise, Mrs. Peabody paused in the doorway, turning back with uncharacteristic hesitation. "You did well, Miss Hawkins," she said quietly. "The whole town's been praying, of course, but it takes more than prayers to see a man through such a fever. It takes dedication." The closest thing to a compliment Susan had ever received from the formidable church matron brought a flush to her cheeks. "Thank you, Mrs. Peabody." Left alone with her daughter and the sleeping Josiah, Susan sank back into her chair, exhaustion washing over her in waves now that the immediate crisis had passed. "He's going to recover, Abigail. The worst is over." Abigail approached the bed, studying Josiah's face with intense concentration. "He looks peaceful now, not all twisted up like last night." Susan smiled tiredly. Yes, sleep is healing him. To her surprise, Abigail climbed carefully onto the foot of the bed, settling cross-legged at a respectful distance from Josiah's covered feet. "I want to be here when he wakes up," she announced. "Abigail, that's not proper." "I have something important to tell him," the child interrupted with unusual determination. "Something about Easter." Susan might have insisted, but the solemnity in her daughter's expression gave her pause. Abigail had witnessed more than her share of grief in her 8 years. Perhaps she had earned the right to witness healing as well. "Very well," Susan conceded, "but be quiet as a church mouse, and if he doesn't wake soon, we'll come back later." They didn't have long to wait. Whether roused by their hushed conversation or simply emerging naturally from his healing sleep, Josiah stirred within minutes. His eyelids fluttered, then opened fully. For the first time in more than a day, his gaze was clear and focused as it settled on Susan. "You're still here?" he rasped, his voice rough from coughing. Susan leaned forward, relief coursing through her. "Where else would I be?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Church. It's Sunday, isn't it?" "Easter Sunday," she confirmed. "But I suspect God will forgive my absence from services just this once." Josiah's gaze drifted around the room, taking in his surroundings with growing awareness. "How long?" "Since the mine? Nearly 2 days." Susan reached for the water glass on the bedside table. "You collapsed after they brought you out. The mine gases affected your lungs, brought on a fever." He accepted the water gratefully, managing a few sips before sinking back against the pillows. I remember. Bits and pieces. Thomas? Is fine. In the kitchen with Mrs. Peabody. Susan hesitated, uncertain how much else he might remember of his feverish ramblings. His expression gave nothing away. A small movement at the foot of the bed drew Josiah's attention. He blinked in surprise at the sight of Abigail perched there, watching him with owl-like solemnity. "Well, good morning, Miss Abigail," he greeted her, his voice weak but warm. "This is an unexpected pleasure." "Good morning, Reverend Fletcher." Abigail straightened her shoulders importantly. "I came because it's Easter, and I have something to tell you." Susan started to intervene. "Abigail, Reverend Fletcher is very weak. Perhaps later—" "No, please." Josiah raised a hand to stop her protest. "I'd like to hear what Miss Abigail has to say." He focused on the child with the same attentive respect he might have shown an adult. "What is it you wanted to tell me, Abigail?" The girl scooted slightly closer, her face earnest in the morning light. "Last night, when you were talking in your sleep, you sounded sad about your wife who died. Like you thought being happy again would make her sad." Susan felt heat rise to her cheeks. "Abigail, that's private." "It's all right." Josiah interrupted softly, his gaze never leaving the child's face. "Go on, Abigail." Encouraged, Abigail continued. "Mama told me that Easter is about new life after sadness. About how even though Jesus died and his friends were crying, God made everything new again." She leaned forward, her expression utterly serious. "Mama says Jesus came back to life, and maybe happy hearts can too." A profound stillness fell over the room. Susan found herself holding her breath, watching as Josiah absorbed the simple yet profound theology from this child's lips. "And," Abigail added, warming to her theme, "when my pa died, I was afraid to laugh again, like maybe it would hurt his feelings in heaven. But Mama said Pa would want me to be happy, even if he couldn't be here to see it." Josiah's eyes glistened suspiciously in the morning light. "Your mama is very wise," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "And so are you, Miss Abigail." The child straightened, pleased with this adult validation. "So I think your wife in heaven wouldn't mind if you smiled again. Or if—" She darted a quick glance at her mother, then back to Josiah. "Or if you found someone new to love. Because that's what Easter means, new life." Susan felt tears prick her eyes at her daughter's simple, profound articulation of hope, something she herself had struggled to embrace after losing John. The possibility that grief, while never truly gone, might someday make room for joy once more. Josiah seemed equally moved. He reached out a trembling hand, which Abigail took with solemn dignity. "Thank you, Abigail," he said quietly. "That's the finest Easter sermon I've heard in a very long time." Satisfied with her message delivered, Abigail slipped off the bed. "I'm going to help Mrs. Peabody with breakfast now," she announced. "Thomas is teaching me how to set the table properly." As the child skipped from the room, Susan found herself alone with Josiah, suddenly awkward in the wake of such emotional transparency. "She's always been an old soul," she said softly, "even before her father died." Josiah's gaze, when it met hers, held a clarity that had nothing to do with the breaking of his fever. "She's remarkable. You've raised her well." "I've done my best." Susan busied herself straightening the bed covers. "How much do you remember? Of the past day or so?" A long pause followed her question. When she finally glanced up, Josiah was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite decipher. "Fragments," he admitted. "The mine. The darkness, being carried here." He hesitated. "And you, always you, keeping watch." Susan looked away, unable to meet the intensity of his gaze. Anyone would have done the same. "No." The single word held quiet conviction. "Not anyone." Another silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions. Finally, Josiah shifted against his pillows, wincing slightly. "Susan," he began, his voice low but steady. "In the mine, when I thought I might not make it out, I had a moment of clarity. About Sarah. About my vow to her memory." Susan's heart stuttered in her chest. "Josiah, you don't need to—" "I do." he insisted gently, because Abigail is right. Easter is about new life after great sorrow, about the possibility of joy when all seems lost. He drew a careful breath. Oh, I don't know if I spoke of this in my fever, but I realized that honoring Sarah doesn't mean refusing all happiness. It doesn't mean denying Thomas a mother's love, or denying myself. He trailed off, seeming to search for the right words. Susan waited, hardly daring to breathe. I'm not proposing, he clarified with a small smile that somehow eased the tension between them. I'm far too weak to get down on one knee, and you deserve better than a half-coherent declaration from a man who hasn't even bathed in 3 days. A startled laugh escaped Susan's lips. Josiah Fletcher! I never thought to hear such immodest talk from a minister. His eyes crinkled at the corners, the first genuine smile she'd seen on his face in days. Even ministers have human concerns, Miss Hawkins, especially when trying to make a favorable impression on a lady. The easy banter felt like a gift. After so much tension, so much worry, Susan found herself smiling back, the weight of exhaustion momentarily lifted from her shoulders. What I'm trying to say, Josiah continued more seriously, is that I've been hiding behind my grief, using it as a shield against risk, against possible pain. His gaze held hers steadily. Abigail reminded me that resurrection isn't just a spiritual concept. It can happen to hearts as well. Outside the window, church bells began to ring, calling the faithful to Easter services. The sound floated through the morning air, joyful and insistent. It appears I'll miss my own Easter sermon, Josiah observed wryly. I suspect God will forgive you just this once, Susan echoed her earlier words. His smile deepened. I suspect he will. And perhaps, he hesitated, then pressed on. Perhaps, when I'm recovered, you might allow me to court you properly, Susan Hawkins, with picnics and walks and conversations that don't involve either of us being at death's door or mortally embarrassed. Joy bubbled up in Susan's chest, as bright and unexpected as spring after a harsh winter. I might consider it, she replied, trying and failing to keep her tone measured. For Thomas's sake, of course. Of course, Josiah agreed, his eyes twinkling despite his weakened state. Purely for the child's benefit. From the kitchen came the clatter of breakfast preparations, the high voices of children helping, the unexpected sound of Mrs. Peabody's laughter. Life continuing, healing beginning, Easter morning with all its promise of renewal. Susan reached out impulsively, taking Josiah's hand in hers. Happy Easter, Reverend Fletcher. His fingers curled warmly around hers, no longer fevered but alive with possibility. Happy Easter indeed, Miss Hawkins. And in that moment, with sunlight streaming through the window and church bells ringing across Redemption Springs, they both recognized the truth in Abigail's simple wisdom. Even hearts long dormant in grief could, with time and courage, experience their own resurrection. Chapter 7. The Sermon Mix-Up. April unfurled across Redemption Springs in a riot of color and scent. Wildflowers carpeted the foothills, painting the landscape in broad strokes of purple lupin and golden poppies. Apple trees in the small orchard behind the church blossomed in delicate pink and white, their sweet fragrance drifting through open windows. Even the creek, which had threatened devastation during the spring floods, now burbled contentedly within its banks, catching sunlight in diamond-bright flashes. For Josiah Fletcher, the arrival of true spring mirrored his own gradual return to health. The mine gases had taken a toll far beyond what he'd initially imagined. For 2 weeks after Easter Sunday, he'd remained confined to his bed, his chest burning with every breath, his strength depleted by the slightest exertion. Dr. Wilson had visited daily, listening to his lungs and prescribing various herbal concoctions that tasted foul, but gradually eased the persistent cough. Throughout his convalescence, the community had rallied around him. Church elders had stepped in to lead services, ladies of the congregation had continued providing meals, even Harold Miller, his own arm splinted and head still bandaged, had hobbled over regularly to keep him company and report on town matters. Most surprising and gratifying had been Susan's continued presence. Despite Harold's recovery and return to the store, she'd maintained her daily visits to the parsonage, bringing fresh baked bread or stewed apples, reading to Thomas from adventure stories, and sitting with Josiah during quiet afternoon hours when the boy napped. They had spoken little about his fever-induced confessions or his tentative suggestion of courtship once he recovered. Such conversations seemed to require more strength than either of them could muster, he because of his physical weakness, she perhaps because of lingering uncertainty. Instead, they'd fallen into a comfortable rhythm of shared tasks and companionable silences, punctuated by discussions of books, scripture, and the children's antics. Now, 3 weeks past Easter, Josiah stood at his study window watching a pair of robins construct a nest in the oak tree that shaded the parsonage. His strength had returned enough that he could manage short walks into town. His lungs, while still occasionally protesting with a deep cough, no longer felt as though they were lined with hot coals. And his mind. His mind had achieved a clarity that felt like a gift from above. A knock at the study door drew his attention from the industrious birds. Thomas poked his head around the doorframe, his expression brightening at the sight of his father, upright and dressed in proper clothing rather than a nightshirt. "Papa, Miss Susan and Abigail are here. They brought a custard pie." Josiah smiled at his son's transparent enthusiasm for anything sweet. "Did they now? Well, you'd better show them in before that pie gets cold." Thomas scampered away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway. Moments later, the sound of female voices drifted from the kitchen. Susan's melodic tones and Abigail's higher pitch, followed by Thomas's excited chatter. For several heartbeats, Josiah remained at the window, allowing himself to savor the domestic sounds. How different the parsonage felt with their presence. Warmer, somehow. More complete. The realization both comforted and disquieted him. During his illness and recovery, he'd spent long hours in prayer and reflection, wrestling with the insights revealed in the mind's darkness and confirmed during his fever. He'd examined his vow to Sarah's memory from every angle, testing whether his changing feelings represented betrayal or healing. Most importantly, he'd sought God's guidance with an openness he hadn't permitted himself in years. The answer, when it had come, hadn't arrived with thunderclaps or blinding light. Instead, it had settled over him gradually, like morning mist dissolving in sunlight. A sense of rightness, of permission, of divine blessing upon the unfolding of his heart. Sarah would always be Thomas's mother, always his first love. But Susan Hawkins represented a second chance he'd never expected. A companionship he hadn't dared to hope for, a completion to the family he and Thomas had struggled to maintain alone. "Reverend Fletcher? Are you well enough for visitors?" Susan stood in the doorway, a basket over her arm, her dove-gray dress setting off the warm chestnut of her hair. A single curl had escaped her careful pinning, brushing against her cheek in a way that made Josiah's fingers itch to tuck it back. "Miss Hawkins." He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Please, come in." "I was just contemplating the season." She entered, setting her basket on a side table. "Your color is much improved. Has Dr. Wilson cleared you to resume your pastoral duties?" "Just yesterday." Josiah returned to his desk chair, noting with satisfaction that sitting no longer triggered immediate exhaustion. "I'll be back in the pulpit this Sunday, provided no setbacks occur." "That's wonderful news." Susan smoothed her skirts with a practiced motion. "The congregation has missed your guidance, though. Elder Barlow has done admirably in your absence. Thomas tells me you've brought custard pie," Josiah said, changing the subject. "You spoil us with your generosity, Miss Hawkins." A becoming flush colored Susan's cheeks. "It's nothing. Merely a way to occupy my hands while Uncle Harold insists on managing the store alone, despite his arm. Stubbornness seems to run in your family." "As does gratitude," she countered. "We haven't forgotten who brought him out of that mine." An awkward silence descended, heavy with unspoken recollections of his collapse, her care, the feverish confessions neither had directly addressed. Josiah cleared his throat. "I've been working on my sermon for Sunday," he said, gesturing to the papers scattered across his desk. "My first since..." Susan leaned forward slightly, her expression warming with interest. What text have you chosen? Isaiah 43:19. Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert. Josiah found himself watching her face carefully as he recited the verse, searching for recognition, for understanding of his intended meaning. Something flickered in her gaze, a momentary widening of her eyes, a slight parting of her lips. A fitting passage for spring, she observed, her voice carefully neutral. For new beginnings. Indeed. Josiah gathered his courage. 3 weeks of contemplation, of prayer, of growing certainty had led to this decision. I'd be honored if you would attend Sunday service, Miss Hawkins. You and Abigail. The message is particularly meaningful to me. We attend every Sunday, Reverend Fletcher, she reminded him, a hint of puzzlement in her tone. Yes, of course. He hesitated, then pressed on. But this Sunday's message holds special significance. I intend to speak about second chances, about the courage it takes to recognize God's blessings when they appear in unexpected forms. Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed by a fleeting vulnerability that made his heart constrict. Josiah, I have said nothing in fever or convalescence that I regret or wish to retract, he interrupted softly. But I believe some matters are best expressed with clear mind and sound body. On Sunday, I hope to articulate what these weeks of reflection have confirmed in my heart. Susan's fingers twisted in her lap, betraying an uncharacteristic nervousness. Such personal revelations seem unorthodox for a sermon. Perhaps, he smiled. But who better to hear God's message of renewal than those who gather specifically to receive his word? And if certain individuals find particular meaning in that message, well, he let the implication hover between them. Before Susan could respond, the patter of small feet announced the children's arrival. Thomas burst into the study with Abigail close behind, both carrying plates with generous slices of custard pie. Miss Susan said we could eat in your study if we're very careful, Thomas announced, his expression suggesting he fully recognized the unprecedented nature of this permission. Did she now? Josiah raised an eyebrow at Susan, who shrugged with an air of mischief that transformed her countenance. I thought perhaps even reverends might bend rules during convalescence, she replied. The domestic scene that followed, children perched carefully with plates, adults conversing about town happenings, the sweet scent of custard filling the book-lined study, settled around Josiah like a blessing. This, he thought as he watched Susan wipe a smudge of pie from Abigail's chin. This is what has been missing. Later, after the Hawkins women had departed with promises to return the following day, Josiah returned to his desk. With renewed purpose, he dipped his pen and began crafting the most important sermon of his life, a message of rebirth, second chances, and the courage to embrace God's unexpected gifts. Each carefully chosen word was a stepping stone toward the future he now dared to imagine. A parsonage filled with voices, a partnership built on shared faith and mutual respect, a family made whole not by forgetting what was lost, but by honoring it while embracing what might yet be. By the time darkness fell, the sermon lay complete before him, its pages representing not just Sunday's message, but his declaration of intent. With it, he would publicly acknowledge his readiness to step from the shadow of grief into the light of new possibility. With it, he would honor Sarah's memory while opening his heart to Susan's presence. As he gathered the precious pages into a neat stack, Josiah felt a sense of peace settle over him. Whatever came of Sunday's sermon, whether Susan responded with acceptance or hesitation, he had found his way through wilderness to clarity. For that alone, his heart offered up thanks as he knelt for evening prayers. Sunday morning dawned clear and mild, the late April air carrying the promise of summer's approaching warmth. Birdsong filtered through Josiah's bedroom window as he knotted his best necktie with fingers that refused to remain steady. Confounded thing, he muttered, untying the crooked result for the third time. From the doorway came a small chuckle. Thomas stood, watching, already dressed in his Sunday best, his usually unruly hair slicked down with water. "You're nervous, Papa," the boy observed with a child's unwavering directness. "Is it 'cause you haven't preached in so long?" Josiah abandoned the tie temporarily, turning to his son with a wry smile. "Partly that," he admitted, "and partly because today's sermon is very important to me." Thomas approached, climbing onto the bed to reach his father's eye level. "Miss Susan will like it," he said with absolute certainty. "She likes everything you say." Heat crawled up Josiah's neck at his son's innocent perception. "Does she now?" The boy nodded solemnly. "Abigail told me her mama smiles different when she talks about you, not like when she talks about other people." "And how does she smile when she talks about me?" Josiah couldn't help asking, even as he recognized the impropriety of mining a child for such information. Thomas considered the question with furrowed brow. "Like when you unwrap a present," he decided finally. "Excited but a little scared, too, in case it might break." The simple description, delivered with a child's unfiltered honesty, resonated with unexpected accuracy. Josiah felt exactly that combination of anticipation and trepidation about the sermon awaiting delivery, like a fragile gift that might shatter if handled incorrectly. "We'd best finish getting ready," he said, ruffling Thomas's smoothed hair and earning an indignant squawk. Reverends and their sons should set an example by arriving early. An hour later, Josiah stood on the church steps greeting early arrivers. Thomas had run ahead to the Sunday school room, eager to show his friends a polished stone he'd found near the creek. The morning sun cast long shadows across the churchyard, where spring flowers nodded their colorful heads in the gentle breeze. "Reverend Fletcher! What a blessing to see you restored to your rightful place." Mrs. Peabody approached, resplendent in a lavender dress and matching hat adorned with artificial violets that bobbed precariously with each determined step. As the church's self-appointed matriarch, she took particular pride in arriving before anyone else on Sundays, the better to oversee all preparations. "Mrs. Peabody." Josiah inclined his head respectfully. "Your kindness during my illness was greatly appreciated." The woman waved away his thanks. Christian duty, nothing more. Her sharp eyes assessed him from head to toe. Still a touch peaked around the edges, but presentable enough. That Susan Hawkins has a nursing touch, I'll give her that. Something in her tone, a knowing quality that suggested she'd drawn conclusions about his feelings for Susan, made Josiah straighten his shoulders. Miss Hawkins was indeed a godsend during my recovery. Mrs. Peabody's thin lips curved in what might generously be called a smile. "Indeed. Well, I'll just see to the sanctuary, make sure all is in order for your first Sunday back." Before Josiah could respond, she bustled past him into the church, her skirts swishing importantly. He suppressed a sigh. Mrs. Peabody's assistance was always offered with the best intentions, though her help occasionally bordered on interference. More parishioners arrived, each offering warm welcomes and expressions of gratitude for his recovery. Josiah greeted them with genuine pleasure, touched by the community's evident concern for his well-being. When Harold Miller appeared with Susan and Abigail beside him, however, Josiah's carefully maintained pastoral demeanor slipped momentarily. Susan wore a dress the color of spring bluebells, her hair arranged in a more elaborate style than her usual practical bun. Abigail skipped alongside in a matching blue frock, clearly delighted with her Sunday finery. The sight of them, lovely and vibrant against the backdrop of Redemption Springs Modest Church, caused Josiah's prepared greeting to evaporate from his mind. "Reverend Fletcher," Harold acknowledged, extending his good hand while the other remained encased in a sling. "Fine morning for your return to the pulpit." "Mr. Miller." Josiah shook the offered hand, then turned to Susan with what he hoped was an appropriately measured smile. "Miss Hawkins, Miss Abigail, I'm pleased you could attend today." Susan's eyes met his briefly, a hint of color touching her cheeks. "We wouldn't miss your return for anything," she replied, her voice carrying just a shade of emphasis that suggested she remembered their conversation about the sermon's special significance. As they moved past him into the church, Josiah caught the faint scent of lavender, Susan's customary toilet water. The delicate fragrance lingered, a reminder of the hours she'd spent at his bedside during his illness, of the gentle hands that had pressed cool cloths to his fevered brow. Shaking himself from such inappropriate recollections, Josiah checked his pocket watch. 20 minutes until the service began. Time enough to review his sermon notes one final time and ensure all was prepared at the pulpit. Inside, the church hummed with pre-service activity. Children scurried between pews while their parents conversed in hushed tones. Sunlight streamed through the simple stained glass window above the altar, casting jewel-toned patterns across the worn wooden floor. The familiar scene calmed Josiah's nerves, reminding him of his calling, of the hundreds of sermons he'd delivered from that very pulpit. None, however, had felt as consequential as today's. As he made his way toward his study at the rear of the church, Josiah noticed Mrs. Peabody emerging from the small room, a self-satisfied expression on her face. "Sanctuary's in order," she reported briskly, "and I've straightened your study as well. Papers everywhere. Most disorderly for a man of the cloth." Alarm prickled along Josiah's spine. "Papers?" Peabody assured him, patting his arm. "Stacked them neatly by the Bible. Couldn't have our preacher fumbling through scattered pages on his first Sunday back." "That's very considerate," Josiah managed, fighting the urge to rush past her immediately. "But I had arranged them in a particular order for reference." Mrs. Peabody's expression turned faintly wounded. "Well, I'm sure you can sort them again if need be. Only trying to help, Reverend." Guilt immediately tempered his concern. "Of course you were, Mrs. Peabody, and I appreciate your thoughtfulness." Modified, the woman nodded and moved toward her customary pew at the front of the church, her hat bobbing importantly above the gathering congregation. Josiah slipped into his study, closing the door behind him. Sure enough, the papers that had been arranged in careful order across his desk now sat in a neat stack beside his Bible. He reached for them, intending to quickly verify the sequence before the service began. A cry from the direction of the Sunday school room interrupted his task. "Papa! Papa, come quick!" Recognizing Thomas's voice pitched high with distress, Josiah abandoned the papers and hurried toward his son's call. He found Thomas in the hallway outside the Sunday school room, tears streaming down his face, blood seeping through the fingers he had pressed to his forehead. "Thomas, what happened?" Josiah knelt, gently pulling the boy's hand away to examine the injury. I was showing Bobby my special rock," Thomas hiccuped between sobs. "And I tripped on the rug and hit my head on the corner of the table." The cut was small, but bleeding freely, as head wounds tended to do. Josiah pulled his handkerchief from his pocket and pressed it gently against the injury. "Hold this here," he instructed, guiding Thomas's small hand to the cloth. "Press firmly." "Is it very bad, Papa?" The child's blue eyes, so like Sarah's, were wide with fear and pain. "No, son. Head cuts bleed a great deal, but this one isn't deep." Josiah lifted Thomas into his arms, the boy's legs wrapping automatically around his waist, despite being nearly too big for such carrying. "Let's clean you up before service begins." In the small washroom at the rear of the church, Josiah carefully cleaned the cut with water, relieved to find it was indeed minor, more frightening than dangerous. A small plaster from the first aid box Mrs. Wilson had insistently placed in every public building in town soon covered the wound. "There," Josiah said, passing Thomas a peppermint from his pocket as comfort. "Good as new, though I believe that handsome suit will need laundering." Thomas glanced down at the spots of blood that had dripped onto his Sunday collar. "Will I still look proper for church?" he asked anxiously. "You said reverends and their sons should set examples." Josiah's heart swelled with affection for this earnest child. "You'll set a fine example of bravery after an accident," he assured him. "Now, let's get you settled before the service begins." The church bell began to toll as they emerged from the washroom, signaling 5 minutes until service commenced. Josiah guided Thomas toward the front pew where the boy usually sat during services, noting with a flutter of anticipation that Susan and Abigail were already seated nearby. "Thomas, what happened?" Susan's concern was immediate as she spotted the plaster. "I fell," Thomas explained, suddenly seeming to enjoy the attention his injury commanded. "Hit my head on the table. Blood everywhere." Abigail leaned forward, impressed. "Did you cry?" "Only a little," Thomas claimed, his earlier sobs apparently forgotten in the company of his friend. Susan's gaze lifted to Josiah's, warm with understanding. Everything all right? Fine now, he assured her, painfully aware of the church filling around them, of the curious glances directed their way, of the precious minutes ticking by before he must ascend to the pulpit. Just a small cut. You should take your place, Susan murmured, nodding toward the front of the church where Elder Barlow stood, checking his pocket watch. We'll keep Thomas with us. Josiah nodded gratefully. I need to gather my sermon notes. Back in a moment. He hurried to his study, acutely conscious of time's pressure. The final toll of the church bell reverberated through the building as he snatched up the stack of papers Mrs. Peabody had so helpfully organized. No time now to verify their order. He'd have to rely on memory and improvisation if necessary. Tucking the papers into his Bible, Josiah straightened his shoulders and offered a quick, silent prayer. Lord, guide my words today. Help me speak truth with love and clarity. As he stepped into the sanctuary and made his way to the pulpit, his gaze automatically sought Susan in the congregation. She sat with Thomas beside her, the boy's head already leaning trustingly against her shoulder. Abigail perched on her other side, hands folded primly in her lap. The tableau they presented, a ready-made family that might yet become reality, filled Josiah's chest with such hope that he nearly stumbled on the pulpit steps. Collecting himself, he placed his Bible on the lectern and opened it to the carefully marked passage in Isaiah. The congregation settled, faces turned expectantly toward him, his flock, returned to his care after weeks of absence. Among them, Susan Hawkins watched with an expression that mingled encouragement and something deeper, more complex. That unwrapping a present look Thomas had so astutely described. Drawing a deep breath, Josiah opened his mouth to begin the most important sermon of his life, unaware that the papers nestled in his Bible would lead him down an entirely different path than the one he had so carefully prepared. The congregation of Redemption Springs Church sat expectantly as Josiah cleared his throat. Sunlight streamed through the stained glass window above the altar, casting kaleidoscope patterns across the worn wooden floors. The pews were uncommonly full. Word had spread that Reverend Fletcher would return to the pulpit after his brush with death in the mine rescue. Josiah's gaze swept across the sea of familiar faces before settling briefly on Susan. She sat straight-backed in the front pew, her blue dress a splash of heaven against the dark wood, her eyes warm with encouragement. Thomas leaned against her shoulder, the small plaster on his forehead visible even from the pulpit. Abigail sat primly on Susan's other side, her small hands folded in her lap, the very picture of Sunday decorum. The sight steadied Josiah's nerves. This moment, this sermon, represented more than his return to pastoral duties. It marked his emergence from the shadow of grief into the light of new possibility. With a final silent prayer, he opened his Bible and pulled forth the papers Mrs. Peabody had so helpfully organized. Brothers and sisters in Christ, he began, his voice strong despite weeks of illness. It gladdens my heart to stand before you again, after the Lord's merciful deliverance from darkness. Murmurs of approval rippled through the congregation. Josiah glanced down at his notes, frowning slightly at the unfamiliar opening paragraph. Had he written this? The illness and fever had left gaps in his memory, but surely he would recall the sermon he'd labored over just yesterday. Perhaps in his weakened state, he'd been more disorganized than he realized. Pressing forward, he continued, Our text today comes from 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 35, and this I speak for your own profit, not that I may cast a snare upon you, but for that which is comely, and that ye may attend upon the Lord without distraction. Confusion flickered briefly across his mind. That wasn't the passage he'd selected. He'd chosen Isaiah's beautiful promise of new beginnings. Yet here, in his own handwriting, was a sermon on... Josiah scanned the page quickly, his stomach sinking as he recognized a fire and brimstone message he'd written months ago during a particularly lonely period of grief. A sermon about guarding one's heart against worldly attachments. His eyes darted up to find Susan watching him, her expression open and anticipatory. In the split second before he could decide how to proceed, Mrs. Peabody's voice called out from her pew. Speak up, Reverend. These old ears aren't what they used to be. The congregation chuckled. And Josiah found himself automatically continuing with the text before him, his mind racing for a solution even as his mouth formed the damning words. In this passage, Paul speaks to the Corinthians about the dangers of allowing earthly attachments to distract us from our heavenly purpose, he read, his voice betraying none of the panic rising in his chest. How often, my friends, do we permit our hearts to stray toward inappropriate entanglements that draw us away from God's ordained path? From the corner of his eye, Josiah saw Susan's posture stiffen slightly. Beside her, Harold Miller's eyebrows rose in evident surprise at the sermon's unexpected direction. A Christian must guard vigilantly against such entanglements, Josiah continued, desperately trying to find a way to transition to his intended message without creating a spectacle, particularly those of us entrusted with the spiritual guidance of others. We must set an example of steadfast commitment to our godly purpose, never allowing fleeting emotions to compromise our sacred duties. The words fell like stones from his lips, each one striking against his true intention with devastating accuracy. How had this happened? Where was his carefully crafted sermon on renewal and second chances? Susan's face, previously warm with anticipation, now reflected growing confusion. Her gaze dropped to her lap, where her gloved fingers twisted together in apparent distress. Thomas, sensing the tension, glanced up at her with concern. Josiah forced himself to pause, to breathe, to maintain his pastoral composure while inwardly scrambling for a solution. He could stop now, explain the mix-up, start over with his true message, but such an admission would draw even more attention to the situation, creating precisely the spectacle he wished to avoid. The scripture reminds us, he pressed on, flipping through the pages in hopes of finding his intended notes, that widowers in particular must be wary of. Here he faltered, the specific reference to his own situation too pointed to ignore. This sermon, this terrible misguided sermon he'd written during a dark night of grief and loneliness, directly contradicted everything he'd come to believe during his recovery. Everything he'd intended to declare today. Susan's head lifted at his pause, her eyes meeting his across the hushed sanctuary. The hurt in her gaze was unmistakable. A wounded bewilderment that pierced Josiah more painfully than any physical injury he'd sustained in the mine. He began, ready to abandon the charade and explain the mistake. But before he could continue, Susan was moving, gathering her reticule with trembling hands, bending to whisper something to Abigail. The girl rose obediently, confusion evident on her small face as her mother took her hand. "Excuse us," Susan murmured, barely audible as she guided Abigail toward the side door, her steps measured despite the evident urgency of her retreat. Harold half rose from his seat as if to follow, but a sharp look from Susan stopped him. Thomas, left behind, watched with wide eyes as the Hawkins women slipped through the door and disappeared. The soft click of the latch echoed in the sudden silence. Josiah stood frozen at the pulpit, the wrong sermon clutched in his hands, the congregation staring in collective confusion at the unexpected departure. Mrs. Peabody's scandalized gasp cut through the quiet like a knife. In that moment, realization struck with perfect clarity. The papers on his desk, his true sermon declaring his feelings for Susan, had been reorganized by Mrs. Peabody's well-meaning hands, buried beneath an old sermon he'd written months ago during his darkest grief. A sermon that now, horrifically, appeared to be a public rejection of the very woman he'd intended to court. "My friends," Josiah said, finding his voice at last, "I find myself indisposed. The lingering effects of my illness—" He broke off, unable to perpetuate the lie. "Forgive me, there has been a mistake." Without further explanation, he closed his Bible with a decisive snap. "Elder Barlow, would you please lead the congregation in a final hymn and benediction? I find I must attend to an urgent matter." Not waiting for a response, Josiah descended from the pulpit with as much dignity as he could muster. Whispers erupted in his wake as he strode down the center aisle, his focus entirely on the side door through which Susan had disappeared. Thomas scrambled from his seat, confusion and worry etched on his young face. "Papa, where's Miss Susan going? What's wrong?" Josiah paused just long enough to place a reassuring hand on his son's shoulder. "A misunderstanding, Thomas. One I intend to correct immediately. Stay with Mr. Miller until I return." As he pushed through the side door into the April sunshine, Josiah sent up the most fervent prayer of his life. Lord, let me find her. Let me explain. Let it not be too late. Josiah burst into the churchyard, momentarily blinded by the transition from the dim sanctuary to the brilliant spring morning. Blinking rapidly, he scanned the surroundings for a glimpse of Susan's blue dress or Abigail's matching frock. There, at the far gate, Susan was hurrying down the lane toward town, her daughter's hand clasped firmly in hers, her spine rigid with what could only be hurt and dignity. "Susan!" Josiah called, abandoning all pretense of formality. "Susan, wait!" Either she didn't hear or chose to ignore him. Her pace quickened, skirts swishing with determination as she rounded the corner onto Main Street. Josiah set off in pursuit, his long legs carrying him swiftly across the churchyard. Behind him, he heard the church doors burst open, followed by the unmistakable rustle of Sunday finery and curious murmurs. The congregation, it seemed, had abandoned Elder Barlow's hymn in favor of a more interesting spectacle. "Reverend Fletcher!" Mrs. Peabody's voice rang out. "Whatever are you doing?" Ignoring the question, Josiah vaulted over the low gate rather than wasting precious seconds opening it, a decidedly unpastoral action that elicited gasps from his parishioners. His boots struck dust as he landed, and he broke immediately into a run, his Sunday coat flapping behind him. Main Street stretched before him, quiet on the Sabbath save for a few townsfolk who turned in astonishment at the sight of their minister racing down the boardwalk in full Sunday regalia. Ahead, Susan maintained her brisk pace, her blue dress visible between the buildings. "Susan," he called again, louder this time. "Please stop. It's not what you think." She hesitated, half turning at his voice, but then continued with renewed determination, guiding Abigail around the corner by the Mercantile. Behind Josiah, the sounds of pursuit grew, not just one or two curious onlookers, but what seemed to be the entire congregation, led by Mrs. Peabody, whose Sunday hat bobbed like a ship's sail above the crowd. News of the spectacle spread quickly. Faces appeared in shop windows and doorways as Redemption Springs citizens emerged to witness their preacher's undignified chase. "What's he doing?" someone asked loudly. "Chasing the widow Hawkins," came the gleeful reply. In his Sunday clothes and half the church behind him, mortification heated Josiah's neck. But he pressed on. This was no time for pastoral dignity or concern for appearances. Not when everything that mattered hung in the balance. Susan led him on a winding path through town, past the general store where Harold Miller's assistant gaped from the doorway, around the blacksmith shop where even on Sunday the smith paused in his private work to stare, down a narrow alley that emerged near the town's small schoolhouse. Abigail trotted dutifully beside her mother, occasionally glancing back with wide eyes at the growing procession. Josiah's breath came in ragged gasps. His lungs, still healing from the mine gases, protested the exertion, but he pushed forward, gaining ground with each stride. Susan was headed away from town now, toward the small rise where Redemption Springs Cemetery overlooked the valley. Understanding dawned. Of course, where else would she go in her distress? To the place where her first husband rested, where she could seek solace in familiar grief rather than face this new pain. The cemetery gate stood open, its wrought iron arch twined with spring-climbing roses. Susan passed beneath it, finally releasing Abigail's hand as they entered the peaceful grounds. "Wait here, dearest," Josiah heard her instruct the child as he approached. "Mama needs a moment alone." Abigail nodded solemnly, settling onto a stone bench near the entrance. Her eyes widened as she spotted Josiah hurrying up the path, followed at a distance by what now appeared to be half the town of Redemption Springs. "She went that way," Abigail offered quietly, pointing toward the cemetery's western section where the newer graves lay. "Thank you," Josiah managed between breaths. He paused, hand on the gatepost. "Abigail, would you do something for me? Would you ask those people," he gestured to the approaching crowd, "to wait here? Tell them this is private?" A look of understanding, far beyond her years, crossed the child's face. She nodded, straightening her shoulders with newfound purpose. As Josiah continued into the cemetery, he heard her clear young voice addressing the congregation with remarkable authority. "Reverend Fletcher says you all need to stay here. This is private church business." The path wound between marble headstones and wooden crosses, some adorned with fresh flowers, others showing signs of neglect. April sunshine warmed the grassy hillside, while meadowlarks trilled from nearby cottonwood trees, oblivious to human drama unfolding among the dead. He found Susan standing between two graves, one marked with a simple wooden cross bearing her first husband's name, the other adorned with a marble headstone engraved with Sarah Elizabeth Fletcher, beloved wife and mother, and a scripture verse Josiah had chosen in his grief, "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted." The symbolism of her position, caught between two marriages, two loves, two lives, struck Josiah with painful clarity. Susan sensed his presence, her shoulders stiffening though she didn't turn. "You needn't have followed me," she said, her voice carefully controlled. "Your message was quite clear from the pulpit." "No," Josiah said, approaching slowly as one might a wounded animal. "It wasn't my message at all." Now she did turn, her face composed but eyes bright with unshed tears. "I don't understand. The sermon I read, it wasn't the one I wrote for today." The words tumbled out, desperate in their urgency. "Mrs. Peabody reorganized my study, placed an old sermon on top, one I wrote months ago during a dark night." Confusion flickered across Susan's features. "An old sermon? From before I knew you. Before the mine. Before I understood." Josiah ran a hand through his hair, disheveling it further. "Susan, the sermon I intended to deliver today was about new beginnings, about second chances, about how God sometimes places unexpected blessings in our path when we're finally ready to receive them." A breeze stirred the cemetery grass, carrying the scent of wildflowers and sun-warmed earth. In the distance, Josiah could see the congregation gathered at the gate, their curiosity held in check only by Abigail's small, determined figure. "I don't know what to believe," Susan said after a long moment. "These past weeks, I thought perhaps, but then your words today seemed a deliberate rejection." "They were never meant for you," Josiah insisted, taking a step closer. They were the words of a grief-stricken man desperately trying to justify his isolation. A man afraid to open his heart again. And now? The question hung between them, laden with possibility. "Now, I understand that honoring Sarah's memory doesn't mean refusing all happiness." Josiah gestured to the graves between them. "Our first loves, they shaped us, blessed us, left parts of themselves with us, but they wouldn't want us frozen in grief." Susan's composure wavered, her lower lip trembling slightly. "How can you be certain? In the mine, in the darkness, when I thought I might die, I saw clearly for the first time in years." Josiah took another step forward, close enough now to see the faint freckles across Susan's nose, the tiny stitches in her collar. "Sarah would want Thomas to have a mother's love. John would want Abigail to have a father's guidance. They would want us to live fully, not merely survive." A single tear escaped, trailing down Susan's cheek. "I've been afraid too," she admitted softly. "We're afraid of betraying John's memory. Afraid of risking my heart again." "I know." Josiah reached out slowly, giving her time to withdraw if she wished. When she remained still, he gently brushed the tear from her cheek. "We've both been hiding behind our grief, using it as a shield against new pain. And now?" Susan echoed her earlier question, her voice barely above a whisper. "Now I find myself standing in a cemetery on a beautiful spring morning, having chased a woman through town in my Sunday best, creating the greatest spectacle Redemption Springs has seen since old Mr. Filbert's mule wandered into the saloon." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "All because I couldn't bear to let you believe, even for a moment, that I didn't cherish the gift of your presence in my life." A watery laugh escaped Susan's lips. "You did create quite a scene. Most undignified for a man of the cloth. Dignity be hanged," Josiah declared with unexpected fervor. "Some things matter more." The breeze freshened, carrying the distant sound of church bells. Elder Barlow had apparently decided to conclude the abandoned service in traditional fashion, despite the absent congregation. The pealing notes floated across the cemetery, a benediction more fitting than any Josiah could have planned. "Susan Hawkins," he said, her name emerging as both question and prayer. Would you permit me to court you properly? Not as a replacement for what either of us has lost, but as a new beginning God has seen fit to offer us. Time suspended as he waited, the birdsong and breeze and distant bells fading to insignificance compared to the importance of her answer. Yes, she said finally, the word emerging soft but certain. Yes, I would like that very much. Relief and joy surged through Josiah's chest. Without conscious thought, he reached for her hands, clasping them warmly between his own. Above them, the branches of a young oak tree rustled, dappling their faces with shifting patterns of sunlight and shadow. I believe, Susan added, with a hint of mischief warming her damp eyes, that you owe me a proper sermon on new beginnings, Reverend Fletcher. Indeed I do, Miss Hawkins. Josiah smiled, feeling lighter than he had in years, though perhaps to a smaller congregation next time. As if on cue, a commotion at the cemetery gate drew their attention. Mrs. Peabody, apparently having lost patience with being kept at bay by an 8-year-old, was attempting to push past Abigail while simultaneously maintaining her grip on her elaborate Sunday hat. The resulting tussle had drawn the spectating congregation into two factions, those supporting Abigail's stalwart defense of privacy and those encouraging Mrs. Peabody's determined advance. "Oh dear," Susan murmured, though her tone suggested more amusement than dismay. "I believe," Josiah observed dryly, "that we've provided Redemption Springs with enough gossip to last until Christmas." Her laugh, bright and uninhibited, rang across the cemetery, startling a meadowlark from its perch. The sound of it, so unexpected in this place of mourning, seemed to transform the hillside from a repository of grief to a promise of joy reborn. "Let them talk," Susan said, a newfound boldness in her voice. "Some things matter more than appearances." Josiah felt his heart expand with gratitude and possibility. Here, standing between the markers of their past loves, he and Susan had begun to chart a course toward a future neither had dared imagine. Not a replacement or substitution for what came before, but something new and precious in its own right. "Shall we rescue your daughter from her guard duty?" he suggested, offering his arm with formal gallantry that belied the extraordinary circumstances. Susan slipped her hand into the crook of his elbow, the gesture both proper and newly intimate. "I suppose we must face the music sometime." As they walked together down the cemetery path, Josiah marveled at the unexpected turns that had led to this moment. A mining accident, a fevered confession, a sermon mix-up that had forced him to chase this remarkable woman through town in most unpastoral fashion. The Lord indeed worked in mysterious ways. At the gate, Abigail's face brightened at the sight of them approaching arm in arm. Behind her, the congregation fell silent, dozens of eyes widening at this confirmation of their speculations. Mrs. Peabody's expression cycled rapidly from scandalized to calculating to something that might, with generous interpretation, be called approval. "Well," the church matriarch declared, adjusting her hat with dignity, "it appears our reverend has found his voice at last, even if it wasn't from the pulpit." A ripple of laughter spread through the onlookers, breaking the tension, and as the spring sun climbed higher over Redemption Springs, Josiah Fletcher, preacher, widower, and man newly awakened to life's second chances, walked back toward town with Susan's hand warm upon his arm and the future opening before them like a book whose most beautiful chapters remain to be written.
Chapter 8. Resurrection of Love. Redemption Springs Cemetery lay peaceful in the late morning sunshine, wildflowers nodding between gravestones, and birdsong filling the air with nature's own hymns. It seemed an unlikely place for new beginnings, this final resting place for ended journeys. Yet here, amidst the stone markers and wooden crosses, Josiah Fletcher felt his heart racing with the urgency of life and possibility. He'd outpaced most of the congregation in his pursuit of Susan, his long strides carrying him swiftly up the cemetery path. Now breathless more from emotion than exertion, he paused at the crest of the gentle hill that overlooked the valley. Susan stood some 20 yards ahead, a solitary figure in blue between two graves. Even from this distance, Josiah recognized both markers. the simple wooden cross bearing John Hawkins' name, and the polished marble headstone he'd selected for Sarah. The symbolism struck him with force. Susan positioned literally between her past and what might be her future, between first love and second chance. As he approached, the soft crunch of his boots on the gravel path alerted her to his presence. She turned, her face composed into careful dignity despite the moisture still visible on her cheeks. The morning sunlight caught in her chestnut hair, illuminating strands of copper and gold usually hidden in shadow. "You followed me," she observed quietly, neither question nor accusation, but simple acknowledgement. "I would have followed you twice as far," Josiah replied, his voice husky with emotion. "Susan, please, what you heard in church was quite clear," she interrupted, though without rancor. "You needn't explain your convictions, Reverend." The formality of the address stung. "No, you don't understand. It wasn't my sermon." Susan's brow furrowed slightly, confusion momentarily displacing hurt. I I don't follow. "The sermon I read today," Josiah explained, the words tumbling out in their urgency. "It wasn't the one I wrote for this Sunday. It was an old one, written months ago, during a dark night of my grief." Understanding dawned slowly across Susan's features. "But how?" "Mrs. Peabody." The name itself was sufficient explanation. "She arrived early to help by organizing my study. The sermon you heard was placed on top of my papers, and when Thomas injured himself," he gestured helplessly, "I grabbed what was there without checking." A dappled shadow played across Susan's face as a breeze stirred the branches of a nearby oak. Her expression flickered between lingering doubt and fragile hope. "What was the sermon you intended?" she asked finally, her voice barely audible above the cemetery's gentle sounds. Josiah drew a steadying breath. "It was about new beginnings, about Isaiah's promise. 'Behold, I am doing a new thing. Now it springs forth. Do you not perceive it? I will make a way in the wilderness and rivers in the desert.'" He took a careful step closer, heartened when Susan didn't retreat. "It was about how sometimes God's greatest blessings arrive in unexpected forms, about how honoring the past doesn't mean refusing the future." Another step brought him near enough to see the flutter of her pulse at the base of her throat, the way her fingers twisted nervously in the folds of her blue skirt. "It was about you, Susan. About us." "Us?" she repeated softly, testing the word as if it were a foreign language. "I'd planned to speak about second chances, about how meeting you has awakened something I thought died with Sarah." Josiah gestured to the graves between them. "Not as a replacement for what was lost, but as a new gift, different but equally precious." Susan's gaze drifted to Sarah's headstone, the marble gleaming in the spring sunlight. "I've been here before," she confessed unexpectedly. "Many times since your illness." Surprise silenced Josiah momentarily. "You've visited Sarah's grave?" A touch of color stained Susan's cheeks. It seemed important somehow to get to know her through the only means available to me. She knelt beside the grave, fingers tracing the scripture verse engraved beneath Sarah's name. "The Lord is near to the brokenhearted," she read aloud. "Psalm 34:18. Josiah supplied automatically, though he'd memorized the verse long ago. "I selected it because it gave you comfort in your grief," Susan finished for him. "Just as similar words comforted me after John passed." She rose gracefully, brushing soil from her skirts. "I noticed the flowers you leave. Mostly wildflowers, though occasional roses from Mrs. Wilson's garden. And the small Bible verses written on paper scraps tucked beneath pebbles." A lump formed in Josiah's throat at the thought of Susan here, quietly observing these private rituals of his grief and remembrance. "Why?" he managed finally. "At first, to understand the woman whose memory held such power over you," she admitted candidly. "Later, to honor her importance, to acknowledge that without her, there would be no Thomas, no you as you are now." Susan's directness, her unflinching confrontation with what might have become an unspoken ghost between them, left Josiah momentarily wordless. In that silence, the cemetery sounds enveloped them. Bees humming among wildflowers, leaves rustling overhead, the distant call of meadowlarks from the valley below. "The last time I came," Susan continued when he didn't speak, I brought flowers for both her and John. She gestured to the fresh daisies adorning both graves, their white petals bright against the cemetery's muted greens and browns. It seemed fitting, somehow, to recognize that our pasts are not in competition, but in harmony. The profound understanding in her words, the acceptance that neither of their first loves would be forgotten or diminished by what might grow between them, moved Josiah more deeply than any declaration of affection could have. Susan Hawkins, he said, her name emerging reverent as prayer, you continue to astonish me with your wisdom and grace. A smile touched her lips, tentative but genuine. Not wisdom, Josiah, just the hard-earned understanding that love doesn't follow neat, orderly paths. It's messy and unexpected, and sometimes arrives when we've convinced ourselves we're undeserving of second chances. Josiah closed the remaining distance between them, standing close enough now that he could see the individual lashes framing her eyes, the tiny stitches in the collar of her dress, the single escaped tendril of hair curling against her temple. The sermon I meant to preach, he said softly, ended with my public acknowledgement that I am ready, more than ready, to begin courting you properly, Susan Hawkins, if you'll permit me. The breeze freshened, carrying the scent of spring grass and Susan's faint lavender toilet water. Around them, the cemetery remained peaceful, the markers of those gone before standing as silent witnesses to this moment of renewal among so much remembrance. Seems to me, Susan replied, her voice steady despite the emotion shining in her eyes, that we've moved well past permission and into certainty, Reverend Fletcher. A weight Josiah hadn't fully acknowledged lifted from his chest at Susan's words. The tension of misunderstanding, the fear that he'd irreparably damaged what had been growing between them, dissolved like morning mist beneath the spring sun. I won't pretend it's been an easy journey, he admitted, the cemetery setting encouraging a candor that might have been difficult elsewhere. After Sarah died, I convinced myself that remaining faithful to her memory meant closing my heart to all possibility of future happiness. Susan nodded, understanding softening her features. It's a common enough fallacy among the grieving, as if joy somehow betrays those we've lost. Exactly. Josiah ran a hand through his already disheveled hair, dislodging his Sunday hat, which he caught absently. I wrapped myself in widowhood like a suit of armor, told myself it protected Sarah's memory, when really, he broke off, searching for words. When really it protected you from risking your heart again, Susan finished gently. Yes, the simple acknowledgement felt like confession. I was afraid, not just of loving again, but of the possibility of losing again. A robin alighted on Sarah's headstone, cocking its head as if listening to their conversation before darting away to a nearby tree. The small interruption gave Josiah a moment to collect himself, to find the words for truths he'd only recently acknowledged. In the mine, he continued, when the air grew foul and I thought I might not see daylight again, everything became startlingly clear. All my careful justifications fell away, and I saw my vow for what it truly was, not honoring Sarah, but hiding from life. Susan's gaze held his, her eyes reflecting the complex emotions his words evoked. I understand that fear, Josiah. After John died, I thought I'd never survive the pain. The idea of opening myself to that possibility again seemed reckless, foolhardy. And yet here we stand, Josiah observed, a smile tugging at his lips despite the solemnity of their surroundings. Here we stand, Susan agreed, her own mouth curved in a small, wondering smile. Though, I confess, I've wrestled with my own guilt about these feelings. She turned slightly, facing John's simple wooden cross. When I realized I was developing feelings for you, I felt as if I were betraying him, erasing him. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper, replacing him in my heart. But you weren't, Josiah said quietly, any more than I could replace Sarah in my heart or you could replace her in Thomas's life. I know that now. Susan's fingers absently traced the embroidered edge of her collar, a self-soothing gesture Josiah had noticed before when she was deep in thought. Love isn't a finite resource, is it? It expands to encompass new connections without diminishing what came before. The theological elegance of her insight struck Josiah with its simplicity and truth. How often had he preached God's infinite love while believing his own heart incapable of similar expansion? When did you become so wise, Susan Hawkins? He asked, not entirely jesting. A genuine laugh escaped her lips, the sound startlingly bright in the cemetery's hush. Not wisdom, just survival, and perhaps, she hesitated, then continued with characteristic directness. Perhaps watching you with Thomas showed me what was possible, the way you honor Sarah's memory while creating your own bond with him. You never try to replace her in his heart, you simply offer him your own distinct love. Josiah had never considered his relationship with his son in precisely those terms, but the parallel resonated with truth. He had never sought to fill Sarah's place in Thomas's life. Rather, he'd created his own unique connection with the boy. "I've been a fool," he said simply. Susan's eyebrows rose in question. "Preaching renewal and resurrection each Easter while refusing to allow my own heart the same possibility." Josiah shook his head at the irony. "It took a mining accident, a near-death experience, and a misplaced sermon to make me see what was right before me. We're neither of us quick studies when it comes to happiness, it seems," Susan observed wryly. A movement at the cemetery gate caught Josiah's attention. Thomas and Abigail had slipped away from the congregation, still gathered at the entrance, and were making their way cautiously up the path. They paused halfway, clearly uncertain whether to approach further. Following his gaze, Susan spotted the children as well. Rather than calling them over or sending them back, she simply watched them for a moment, her expression softening. "They've become inseparable, haven't they?" "Like peas in a pod," Josiah agreed. "Thomas talks of little else but Miss Abigail's opinions and adventures. And Abigail has developed a sudden interest in biblical stories since meeting your son," Susan added with a smile, "particularly those involving brave boys facing impossible odds." The children, seeing themselves observed, had stopped their advance. They stood hand in hand, watching with solemn expressions that belied their young ages. There was something both touching and comical about their obvious concern for the adults' interaction, as if they understood the gravity of the moment far better than their years should allow. "They're hoping for a happy ending," Josiah observed quietly. "Aren't we all?" Susan's voice carried a warmth that seemed to embrace the children even at a distance. The breeze picked up, carrying a loose strand of Susan's hair across her face. Without thinking, Josiah reached out to tuck it gently behind her ear, his fingers lingering against the softness of her cheek. The simple contact, the first intimate touch he'd initiated between them, sent warmth cascading through his chest. Susan didn't pull away. Instead, her eyes met his with a clarity and certainty that answered questions he hadn't yet found the courage to ask aloud. "In the mine," he said softly, "when I thought each breath might be my last, I made a promise. I vowed that if God granted me deliverance, I would honor Sarah's memory not by hiding from life, but by embracing it fully, by opening my heart to the gift he'd placed before me." "And what gift was that?" Susan asked, though her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. "You," Josiah said simply. "You and Abigail. The possibility of family restored, of joy renewed." Susan's hand rose to cover his where it still rested against her cheek. "I made a similar promise," she confessed, "when you lay burning with fever, speaking of Sarah one moment and me the next. I promised God and myself that if you recovered, I would find the courage to reach for happiness again, not as a betrayal of what was lost, but as gratitude for what might yet be found." From the corner of his eye, Josiah saw Thomas take a tentative step forward, clearly interpreting the adult's posture as promising. Abigail tugged him back, whispering something in his ear that made the boy nod sagely. "I believe," Josiah said with a smile, "that we have an audience." Susan didn't turn. "Two audiences, actually. The town appears quite invested in our conversation." At the cemetery gate, the congregation remained gathered, their Sunday finery bright against the wrought iron fence. Mrs. Peabody stood at the forefront, her elaborate hat tilted at a precarious angle as she strained to observe the scene unfolding on the hillside. Beside her, Mr. Peabody appeared to be attempting to draw her away, with limited success. Redemption Springs has had precious little entertainment since the flood, Josiah observed dryly. I suppose we've provided quite the Sunday spectacle. Let them look, Susan said with unexpected boldness. Some truths deserve witnesses. Her words, so direct, so unencumbered by the hesitation that had marked their previous interactions, sparked something warm and certain in Josiah's chest. Here, surrounded by reminders of mortality and loss, Susan Hawkins stood before him, vibrant with life and possibility. Susan, he said, his voice lower now, meant only for her despite their audience. I find myself at a crossroads I never expected to reach again in this life. The path forward isn't without its complications. We both carry histories, responsibilities, precious memories, but I believe with complete conviction that it's the path God intends for us. He took both her hands in his, aware of the momentous nature of the gesture, given their public setting. I'm not proposing marriage this moment. That will come when the time is right. But I am proposing a future, one we build together, honoring what came before while embracing what lies ahead. Susan's fingers tightened around his, her eyes bright with unshed tears. I'd like that very much, Josiah Fletcher. The simplicity of her acceptance, free from qualification or hesitation, washed over Josiah like a benediction. Acting on impulse and emotion rather than careful consideration, he drew her gently forward into an embrace that would have scandalized half the town, had they been close enough to witness it fully. For a moment, Susan stiffened in surprise at this public display of affection. Then, with a small sound that might have been either laughter or a suppressed sob, she relaxed against him, her head finding its place beneath his chin, as if designed to fit precisely there. They stood thus for several heartbeats, surrounded by the markers of those gone before, yet profoundly alive to the present moment and future promise. The warmth of Susan in his arms, the subtle scent of lavender rising from her hair, the steady rhythm of her breathing against his chest, all spoke of life's persistence, of love's renewal, of hope's quiet triumph over loss. At the edge of his awareness, Josiah registered a small commotion. Glancing up without releasing Susan, he saw Thomas and Abigail finally abandon their restraint, racing up the cemetery path hand in hand, their faces alight with uncontained joy. "Papa!" Thomas called, all decorum forgotten in excitement. "Is Miss Susan going to be my new mamma now?" Behind the children, at the cemetery gate, the congregation erupted in a buzz of conversation. Mrs. Peabody's voice rose above the others. "Well, I never. In broad daylight on the Sabbath?" Mr. Peabody's response carried with surprising clarity. "Oh, hush, Gertrude. It's about time." With that, the portly shopkeeper took his wife's arm firmly and began guiding her away from the gate. One by one, the other congregants followed suit, dispersing with varying degrees of reluctance to give the newly formed family its privacy. Only Mrs. Peabody continued to protest, her elaborate hat bobbing indignantly as her husband led her determinedly down the lane toward town. Left alone on the hillside, save for the approaching children and the silent witnesses of headstones, Josiah and Susan separated just enough to face one another, their hands still linked between them. "It appears," Susan said with a smile that transformed her entire countenance, "that we've received both divine and community blessing, however reluctant Mrs. Peabody's might be." Josiah laughed, the sound surprising him with its freedom. How long had it been since he'd laughed with such abandon? God does work in mysterious ways, including apparently through sermon mix-ups and scandalous cemetery embraces. As Thomas and Abigail reached them, slightly breathless from their run, Josiah felt the pieces of his life shifting, realigning into a new pattern he couldn't have imagined when he'd awakened that morning. Where once had been fragments, himself and Thomas, broken by Sarah's death, Susan and Abigail, displaced by John's passing, now stood the possibility of wholeness. Not a replacement for what was lost, not a forgetting of first loves, but a resurrection of joy, a renewal of purpose, a second chance granted through grace and embraced with courage. Thomas, he said, kneeling to his son's level while keeping one hand linked with Susan's. Miss Susan isn't going to be your new mama just yet. These things take time and proper steps. The boy's face fell momentarily before Josiah continued. But if all goes well, and if Miss Susan and Abigail agree when the time is right, then yes, we may indeed become a family together. Thomas's eyes widened, darting between the adults with naked hope. Really, truly? Really, truly, Susan confirmed, her free hand reaching out to smooth the boy's perpetually unruly cowlick. But, as your papa says, these things have proper steps. Abigail, who had remained uncharacteristically silent, suddenly spoke up. Like courting? With buggy rides and picnics and such? Susan's surprised laugh joined Josiah's. Yes, dearest, like courting. My mama had a book about proper courting, Abigail informed them seriously. It said gentlemen must always bring flowers and never stay past 8 o'clock unless there's a chaperone. Did it indeed? Josiah asked, amused by the child's unexpected knowledge of etiquette. Well, I shall endeavor to follow all proper protocols. The sun had climbed higher during their time in the cemetery, now directly overhead and warming the spring air to true comfort. Around them, wildflowers nodded in the gentle breeze, and birdsong filled the peaceful hillside with nature's own celebration of life's persistence. From his kneeling position, Josiah looked up at Susan, framed by blue sky and sunshine, her face alight with the same wonder and possibility he felt expanding within his own chest. Between them stood their children, not by blood, but by love, already forming bonds that would strengthen with time and care. I believe, he said, rising to his feet while keeping hold of both Susan's hand and Thomas's, that we've provided Redemption Springs with quite enough to talk about for one Sunday. Shall we return to town and face whatever awaits us there? Susan nodded, extending her free hand to Abigail, who took it eagerly. Together, she said simply. The word contained multitudes, promise and challenge, comfort and courage, past, honored, and future embraced. As they began their descent from the cemetery hill, the four of them linked in an unbroken chain. Josiah felt gratitude swell within him for this unexpected resurrection of his heart. Behind them, the graves of Sarah Fletcher and John Hawkins remained, forever part of who they were and what had shaped them. But ahead lay Redemption Springs, aptly named, for this family being born not from forgetting but from remembering, not from replacing but from expanding, not from denial of grief but from acceptance of joy. Spring sunshine illuminated their path as they walked down the hill toward town, toward home, toward a future none of them could have predicted, but all now embraced with hope and faith and the courage to begin again. 2 weeks passed in a sweet haze of courtship that set Redemption Springs buzzing with approving gossip. Reverend Fletcher's buggy was seen regularly at the Miller residence. Miss Hawkins brought fresh baked bread to the parsonage almost daily. The children were inseparable at school and church functions alike. Even Mrs. Peabody, after initial scandalized huffing, had declared it God's own matchmaking when Josiah delivered the sermon he'd originally intended, the one about new beginnings and second chances. On a particularly fine Saturday in mid-May, with wildflowers painting the meadows in swaths of purple lupin and golden poppies, Josiah loaded a wicker picnic basket into his buggy with unusual care. Thomas hovered nearby, barely containing his excitement. Is everything ready, Papa? He asked for the third time, peering into the basket. Did you pack the special thing? It's safe in my pocket, Josiah assured him, patting the small bulge in his vest. And yes, everything is ready. The boy bounced on his toes. And you're really going to ask today? You promise? Josiah knelt to his son's level, straightening the boy's collar. Yes, I promise. But remember, Thomas, this is a solemn occasion, despite the joy it brings. You must comport yourself with dignity. Yes, sir. Thomas nodded seriously, though his eyes sparkled with barely contained excitement. But after, can Abigail and I play by the creek? After, Josiah confirmed, ruffling the boy's hair affectionately. Now climb up. We don't want to keep the ladies waiting. The short journey to the Miller residence passed in comfortable silence. Spring had fully established itself across the valley, trees clothed in new green, meadowlarks trilling from fence posts, calves frolicking in pastures. Even the scars left by the spring flood had healed, with fresh grass covering the damaged creek banks. As they rounded the final bend, Josiah felt his heart quicken at the sight of Susan and Abigail waiting on the front porch. They wore matching dresses of butter yellow calico, their hair arranged in similar braided coronets. The tableau they presented, mother and daughter framed by the white porch posts, spring sunshine illuminating their faces, momentarily stole Josiah's breath. "They look like angels," Thomas whispered, awestruck. "That they do, son," Josiah agreed softly. "That they do." Harold Miller emerged from the house behind them, his splinted arm now free of its sling but still held carefully against his chest. He waved with his good hand, a knowing smile visible beneath his salt and pepper beard. "Right on time, Reverend," he called as Josiah brought the buggy to a halt. "These ladies have been ready since dawn, I reckon." Susan's cheeks colored prettily at her uncle's teasing. "Hardly dawn, Uncle Harold. We simply didn't wish to keep Reverend Fletcher waiting." "Josiah," he corrected gently, climbing down to help her into the buggy. "I believe we established that some time ago." Her smile, warm and unguarded, sent a pleasant warmth cascading through his chest. "Josiah," she amended, accepting his hand. The brief contact as he assisted her and Abigail into the buggy, her fingers warm and soft against his palm, reinforced the certainty of what he planned today. The past weeks of proper courtship had only confirmed what his heart had known since awakening from his fever. Susan Hawkins was meant to be his wife, Abigail's new father, the missing piece that would make their broken family whole again. As the buggy pulled away, Harold called after them, "Mind you have her back by supper, Reverend." "No promises, Mr. Miller," Josiah called back, with uncharacteristic boldness, earning a scandalized gasp from Susan and giggles from the children. "Josiah Fletcher," Susan scolded, though her eyes danced with mirth. "You'll set tongues wagging again." "Let them wag," he replied easily, guiding the horse toward their destination. "I suspect we've given Redemption Springs enough to talk about that one more afternoon won't signify." The spot Josiah had selected for their picnic lay a mile outside town, where Redemption Creek widened into a gentle pool before continuing its journey toward the river. A stand of cottonwoods provided dappled shade, while the surrounding meadow burst with spring's colorful abundance. He'd discovered the location years ago while fishing with Reverend Morris, his predecessor, and had returned occasionally for solitary reflection. Today, however, was for shared joy, not solitude. "It's beautiful," Abigail exclaimed as the buggy crested the small rise overlooking the creek. "Look, Mama, butterflies!" Indeed, dozens of yellow and white butterflies danced above the wildflowers, their delicate wings catching sunlight as they flitted from bloom to bloom. The sight seemed a good omen, a visible representation of transformation and new life. Thomas could barely wait for the buggy to stop before scrambling down. "Come on, Abigail, I'll show you where the minnows swim." "Children," Susan called as they prepared to dash off, "help set up the picnic first, then you may explore." With the children's assistance, more enthusiastic than effective, the picnic was soon arranged beneath the largest cottonwood. A patchwork quilt spread across the grass, weighted at the corners with smooth creek stones. The basket yielded cold chicken, biscuits, apple preserves, and a special treat of lemon cakes that Thomas had helped bake the previous evening. "May we go to the creek now, Papa?" Thomas asked after helping Josiah arrange the last of the food. Josiah glanced at Susan, who nodded her permission. "You may, but stay where we can see you. And Thomas," he added significantly, "remember our agreement." The boy nodded solemnly before grabbing Abigail's hand. "Come on, I know where frogs hide their eggs." As the children's excited voices faded toward the creek bank, Susan arranged her skirts more comfortably on the quilt. "What agreement was that?" she inquired, accepting the tin cup of lemonade Josiah offered. "Just a matter between men," he replied with a mysterious smile. "Thomas has been entrusted with certain responsibilities today." Susan's eyebrow arched delicately. "How mysterious you've become, Reverend Fletcher. What are you plotting?" Rather than answering directly, Josiah settled beside her on the quilt. close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. The dappled sunlight filtering through cottonwood leaves cast shifting patterns across Susan's face, highlighting the gold flecks in her brown eyes. "These past weeks," he began, suddenly finding his carefully prepared speech inadequate, "have been the happiest I've known since Sarah passed." Susan's expression softened. "For me as well," she admitted quietly. "I had forgotten how pleasant it is to be courted. I've done my best to follow all proper protocols," Josiah said with a smile. "Though I fear buggy rides and church picnics hardly constitute the grand courtship you deserve." "Grand courtship?" Susan repeated with amusement. "What would that entail? Orchestras, Parisian restaurants, royal balls?" "Perhaps just more than what a frontier preacher can provide." Susan's hand found his on the quilt between them, her touch light but deliberate. "Josiah Fletcher, I've had my fill of grand gestures. John courted me with elaborate dinners and expensive trinkets. While I cherish his generosity, I've come to value sincerity far more than spectacle." Her simple declaration settled something in Josiah's chest. Reaching into his vest pocket, he extracted the small velvet pouch he'd carried for days, waiting for the perfect moment. "I had planned a more formal speech," he confessed, "but find words inadequate for what I wish to express." Susan's eyes widened as she recognized the significance of the moment. Her fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his. "Before I proceed," Josiah continued, his voice lower now, meant only for her, "I want to assure you that I've spoken with Harold. He's given his blessing, though he claims you're far too independent to require a guardian's permission." A small laugh escaped Susan's lips. "Uncle Harold understands me well." With deliberate formality, Josiah rose from the quilt and knelt before her, the velvet pouch cradled in his palm. The position, so traditional in one sense, yet undertaken in this unconventional setting, seemed to embody their entire courtship, respectful of tradition while forging a new path. "Susan Hawkins," he began, his voice steady despite the thundering of his heart, "I come to you today, not merely as a man seeking a wife, though I do seek that honor with all my heart." He opened the pouch, revealing not the expected ring, but a small gold locket, its surface engraved with intertwining vines and flowers. "What I propose is more than a marriage between two people," he continued, holding the locket so it caught the sunlight filtering through the leaves. "It is a covenant between four souls, a promise to build something new while honoring what came before." Susan's eyes glistened as she accepted the locket, her fingers trembling slightly as she examined the delicate craftsmanship. "Open it," Josiah encouraged softly. With careful fingers, Susan unclasped the tiny golden hasp. Inside lay not the traditional lock of hair or single portrait, but 4 miniature photographs arranged in a quatrefoil pattern. Josiah, Thomas, Susan, and Abigail, their faces tiny but distinct. "How did you—" she began, wonder evident in her voice. "Mr. Matheson, the photographer, owed me a favor," Josiah explained. "I had him take Thomas's and my portraits last week. For you and Abigail, he worked from the photograph in your locket, the one you showed me with pictures of you and John." Ah, tears spilled onto Susan's cheeks. "It's the most thoughtful gift I've ever received." "It's more than a gift," Josiah said gently. "It's a promise that what we build together will never erase what came before, that Sarah and John will always have a place in our hearts and our family story, that Thomas and Abigail are not afterthoughts in this covenant, but essential participants." From the creek bank came a muffled giggle, quickly hushed. Josiah glanced over to see Thomas and Abigail watching wide-eyed from behind a cluster of willows, no longer even pretending interest in minnows or frog eggs. With a small smile, Josiah turned back to Susan. "I believe our audience grows impatient." Susan laughed softly through her tears, glancing toward the poorly concealed children. "They've been plotting with you, haven't they?" "Thomas, at least," Josiah admitted. He helped select the locket in Mr. Walter's jewelry case. Returning his attention fully to Susan, Josiah took her hands in his. The locket nestled between their palms. "Susan Hawkins, Will you do me the profound honor of becoming my wife, Thomas's mother, and allowing me to be Abigail's father? Will you join your life with ours, not to replace what was lost, but to create something new and precious from what remains? Susan's answer came not in words, but in movement. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and pressed her lips gently to his, a kiss as brief as it was meaningful, propriety observed even in this intimate moment. Yes, she whispered as she drew back, her eyes shining. With all my heart, yes. Before Josiah could respond, excited shrieks erupted from the creek bank as Thomas and Abigail abandoned all pretense of patience. They raced toward the cottonwood, faces alight with joy. She said yes, Thomas shouted, launching himself at his father with such enthusiasm that Josiah nearly toppled backward from his kneeling position. I heard her. Abigail approached more cautiously, her expression hopeful but uncertain until Susan opened her arms. Come here, dearest. Yes, I've agreed to marry Reverend Fletcher. So, Thomas will be my brother? The girl asked, eyes wide with wonder as she settled against her mother's side. Yes, Susan confirmed, smoothing Abigail's hair. And Reverend Fletcher will be your new father. Abigail considered this solemnly before turning to Josiah. May I call you Papa then, like Thomas does? The simple question, so direct, so trusting, brought a lump to Josiah's throat. I would be honored, Abigail, he managed. The girl nodded, apparently satisfied with this arrangement. Thomas said you had a special surprise. Is this it? She pointed to the locket still nestled in her mother's palm. This is part of it, Susan explained, showing the tiny photographs to her daughter. See? All four of us together. Oh, Abigail's face lit with delight. It's like a tiny version of our family. Exactly so. Josiah agreed, his chest tight with emotion at the child's immediate understanding. Thomas tugged at his father's sleeve. Now, can we show them the other surprise, please, Papa? With a nod of permission, Thomas dashed back to the buggy, returning moments later with a small canvas bundle. We made it yesterday, he exclaimed proudly, carefully unfurling the fabric. It was a simple banner, painted with childish care on a flour sack. In uneven letters brightened with wildflower pigments, it proclaimed, The Fletcher family, Mama, Papa, Thomas, and Abigail. Thomas thought we should have a family flag, Josiah explained, touched anew by his son's enthusiasm for their blended family. For the church picnic next month. Abigail clapped her hands in delight. My name is on it! I'm a Fletcher too! You will be, Susan confirmed, meeting Josiah's gaze over the children's heads. After the wedding. Thomas bounced impatiently. When will that be? Tomorrow? The adults' laughter mingled with the cottonwood's rustling leaves and the creek's gentle burble. Such arrangements take time, son, Josiah explained, though in truth he would have happily married Susan that very afternoon. There are preparations to be made, announcements to be published. Easter, Susan interrupted unexpectedly. We should marry on Easter Sunday. Josiah blinked in surprise. Easter? But that's nearly a year away. Susan's smile held a quiet certainty. It seems fitting, doesn't it? The day that celebrates resurrection and new life. The day that reminds us joy can follow even the deepest sorrow. Understanding dawned as Josiah recalled their conversation during his fever, when Abigail had shared her innocent wisdom about Easter meaning that happy hearts can come back to life too. The symmetry of it, celebrating their union on the very day that symbolized renewal, felt divinely ordained. Easter it shall be, he agreed, his heart overflowing with gratitude for this woman who understood so perfectly the spiritual significance of their journey together. As the children resumed their exploration of the creek, now chattering excitedly about being siblings, Josiah settled beside Susan on the quilt. She leaned against his shoulder with newfound ease, the locket clasped in her hand like a talisman. A year seems an awfully long time to wait, he murmured, permitting himself the intimacy of pressing his lips briefly against her temple. Good things are worth waiting for, Susan replied wisely. Besides, a year will give Redemption Springs time to fully embrace the idea of their widowed preacher remarrying. I believe they're already quite reconciled to the notion, Josiah chuckled. Mrs. Peabody assured me just yesterday that she'd known all along we were meant for each other. Susan's laugh joined his, bright and unfettered. What a remarkable revision of history. I distinctly recall her scandalized expression at the cemetery. She merely needed time to convince herself the match was her idea all along. They fell into comfortable silence, watching Thomas demonstrate to Abigail how to skip stones across the creek's surface. The afternoon sun burnished the scene with golden light, transforming ordinary moments into treasured memories. I never thought to feel this way again, Susan admitted softly. After John died, I believed that part of my life was finished, that my role henceforth was simply to be Abigail's mother, nothing more. Josiah covered her hand with his. I felt much the same, that Sarah's death marked the end of certain possibilities. And yet, here we are. Susan's fingers interlaced with his, warm and steady, beginning again. Not just beginning, Josiah corrected gently, continuing, carrying forward all that made us who we are, including those we've loved and lost. Susan nodded, understanding deepening her expression. A resurrection of love, not a replacement of it, precisely. Above them, cottonwood leaves danced in the spring breeze, their whispered rustling like nature's benediction upon the covenant newly formed beneath their branches. New life sprouting from established roots, a fitting metaphor for the family taking shape on this perfect May afternoon. Easter Sunday dawned clear and glorious, as if heaven itself had blessed the occasion. Sunrise painted Redemption Springs in hues of rose and gold, illuminating dew-kissed gardens where crocuses and daffodils nodded their colorful heads. Church bells pealed joyfully across the valley, calling the faithful to celebrate both Christ's resurrection and the union of two beloved community members. Inside the church, transformation had occurred. Under Mrs. Peabody's exacting direction, the simple sanctuary bloomed with Easter lilies, their trumpet-shaped flowers symbolizing purity and new beginnings. Spring blossoms festooned every pew end, tied with ribbons in the soft lavender shade Susan had chosen for her wedding dress. The altar, usually adorned only with a simple cross, now featured an arch of flowering apple branches, their delicate pink-white blooms releasing a sweet fragrance with each gentle breeze. In the small anteroom that served as Josiah's study, Thomas fidgeted as Elder Barlow helped him with his necktie. "Stand still, young man," the elder admonished gently. "Your father needs you looking proper when you carry those rings." "Yes, sir," Thomas replied, though his small body practically vibrated with excitement. "Is it time yet? Papa said I mustn't be late." "Not quite yet." Elder Barlow stepped back to inspect his handiwork. "There. A fine-looking young man, ready for his important duty." Thomas beamed, resplendent in his new suit, his first grown-up attire with long trousers rather than short pants. The brass buttons gleamed from repeated polishing, and his usually unruly hair had been tamed with sweet-smelling macassar oil. "Papa says I'm the Marshal of the Rings," he announced proudly. "Marshal," Elder Barlow corrected with a smile, "a very important position indeed." A soft knock preceded Josiah's entrance. He wore his Sunday best, freshly brushed and pressed, with a sprig of apple blossom in his lapel. His face, cleanly shaved and flushed with anticipation, bore little resemblance to the gaunt, fever-stricken man who had emerged from the mine nearly a year before. "There's my marshal," he said warmly, kneeling to straighten Thomas's already straight tie. "Are you ready for your duties, son?" Thomas nodded solemnly, patting the small velvet cushion he carried. "The rings are tied on real tight, just like we practiced." "I won't drop them, Papa. I promise." "I know you won't." Josiah squeezed the boy's shoulder affectionately. "Now go with Elder Barlow. He'll tell you when to come down the aisle." As Thomas scampered off with the elder, Josiah took a moment alone in his study. The past year had unfolded like a beautiful dream. Courtship evenings on the Miller porch swing, Sunday afternoons with the children at the creek, quiet conversations with Susan that deepened their connection with each passing week. They had taken their time, allowing the community to adjust to their relationship, giving Thomas and Abigail space to form their own bonds. The year of waiting, which had initially seemed an eternity, had proven Susan's wisdom yet again. By the time bans were posted in February, not a soul in Redemption Springs expressed anything but delight at the impending union. Even Mrs. Peabody had transformed from reluctant spectator to enthusiastic champion, appointing herself unofficial wedding coordinator with a zeal that occasionally required gentle tempering. That woman Susan had observed fondly after one particularly intense planning session has adopted our wedding as her personal mission from God. Now, as Josiah heard the sanctuary filling with townsfolk in their Easter finery, a profound sense of rightness settled over him. This day, celebrating resurrection, renewal, God's triumph over death itself, seemed perfectly ordained for beginning their life together. A knock interrupted his reverie. Harold Miller entered, his splinted arm long healed, his face wreathed in smiles. "It's time, Reverend," he announced. "Elder Barlow says the church is full to bursting." Josiah nodded, drawing a steadying breath. "And Susan? Abigail?" "Waiting in the vestry, pretty as pictures." Harold's voice softened. "My Susan hasn't looked so radiant since the day she married John. It does my heart good to see her so happy again." The two men shared a moment of understanding. Harold, who had welcomed his widowed niece and her daughter when they had nowhere else to turn. Josiah, who would now make them part of his family. "I'll care for them with everything in me," Josiah promised quietly. "I know you will, son." Harold clapped him on the shoulder. "Now get out there before Mrs. Peabody has an apoplexy. She's been straightening flower arrangements for the past hour like the Lord himself might notice a crooked lily." In the sanctuary, Josiah took his place beneath the flowering arch, Elder Barlow beside him, to perform the ceremony. The congregation rose as Mrs. Wilson began playing "Jesus Christ is Risen Today" on the small pump organ, its triumphant notes filling the church with Easter joy. Thomas entered first, his small face a study in concentration as he carefully balanced the ring cushion. The congregation's collective "Aww" nearly broke his solemn demeanor, but he maintained his dignity all the way to the altar, taking his place beside his father with evident pride. Then came Abigail, resplendent in a dress the same lavender shade as her mother's. She scattered rose petals from a small basket, each step measured and precise as she'd practiced for weeks. Her dark hair, arranged in elaborate ringlets, bounced with each deliberate movement. When she reached the altar, she turned toward the rear of the church, her face alight with anticipation. The congregation followed her gaze, rising again as Mrs. Wilson transitioned to the traditional wedding march. Susan appeared in the doorway on Harold's arm, and Josiah felt his breath catch in his throat. Her dress, a practical but beautiful creation of lavender silk, complemented her chestnut hair and fair complexion perfectly. No white wedding gown for this mature bride, but the simple elegance of her attire surpassed any debutante's finery. As she moved down the aisle, Josiah noticed the special pocket sewn into her skirt, visible only because her hand rested upon it. Inside, he knew she carried Sarah's Bible and John's pocket watch, tangible reminders of the loves that had shaped them both. When Susan reached the altar, Harold placed her hand in Josiah's with simple dignity. Their eyes met, and the rest of the world seemed to recede. No congregation, no children, just two souls on the threshold of a journey long in coming. Elder Barlow's rich voice broke the spell. "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here in the sight of God and these witnesses on this most holy day of resurrection to join together this man and this woman in the bonds of holy matrimony." The ceremony proceeded with traditional solemnity, the familiar words taking on new depth in the context of their particular journey. When the time came for their vows, Josiah had requested a slight departure from convention. Elder Barlow nodded, stepping aside to allow the bridegroom to speak directly to his bride. "Susan," Josiah began, his voice steady and clear, "I come to you not as a perfect man, but as one who has known both profound joy and devastating loss. I bring to our union a past blessed by love, a present filled with gratitude, and a future bright with hope." He took both her hands in his, aware of Thomas and Abigail watching wide-eyed beside them. "I vow not to replace what you have lost, but to honor it as part of who you are. I promise to cherish Abigail as my own daughter, to provide for her, guide her, and love her all the days of my life." Tears glistened in Susan's eyes, but her voice remained steady as she responded, Josiah, I likewise come to you as a woman shaped by both happiness and heartache. I bring to our marriage my whole self, past joys, present blessings, and future dreams. Her fingers tightened around his. I vow to honor the place Sarah holds in your heart and Thomas's life, never seeking to diminish her importance or memory. I promise to love Thomas as my own son, to nurture him, guide him, and stand by him through all of life's journeys. Elder Barlow stepped forward again. The rings, please. Thomas approached proudly, holding the cushion steady as the elder untied first one gold band, then another. They were simple rings, plain but of good quality, inscribed inside with the words, "Behold, I make all things new." After the exchange of rings and Elder Barlow's pronouncement of their union, the congregation erupted in applause, a break from traditional church decorum that spoke volumes about the community's investment in this marriage. Mrs. Wilson struck up a joyful hymn as Josiah kissed his bride with reverent tenderness, sealing their covenant before God and Redemption Springs. The recessional down the aisle became a family affair, with Thomas and Abigail falling in behind their parents, their small faces radiant with satisfaction at this formalization of what had already become reality in their hearts. Outside the church, spring sunshine bathed the gathering in golden light. As the newlyweds paused on the steps, Mrs. Peabody stepped forward with uncharacteristic emotion shining in her eyes. "One final surprise," she announced, pressing a small wooden box into Susan's hands. "From the Ladies' Aid Society." Curious, Susan opened the box to reveal dozens of painted lady butterflies, their wings opening and closing slowly as they waited for release. "Symbols of transformation," Mrs. Peabody explained with unexpected poetry, "of new life emerging from what was before." Understanding the intended symbolism, Susan passed the box to Josiah. Together, they lifted the lid fully, watching as the butterflies took wing, spiraling upward in a living cloud of orange, black, and white. The gathered townsfolk gasped in delight at the spectacle, children pointing and laughing as butterflies danced through the air. One butterfly, more bold than its companions, alighted briefly on Susan's shoulder before joining the others in their ascent toward the perfect blue sky. The moment seemed divinely choreographed, nature itself blessing their union with beauty and promise. As the butterflies dispersed and the crowd moved toward the churchyard where tables groaned beneath Easter dinner offerings, Josiah drew Susan slightly aside. Thomas and Abigail had already dashed ahead, eager to inspect the enormous cake Mrs. Wilson had baked for the occasion. "Mrs. Fletcher," he said softly, savoring the new name on his lips. Susan's smile illuminated her entire countenance. "That will take some getting used to. We have a lifetime for that adjustment." Josiah's hand found hers, their matching rings catching the spring sunlight. "Are you happy truly?" "More than I believed possible again in this life," she answered simply. "It feels like resurrection," he supplied, when she hesitated. "Yes." Her eyes, bright with unshed tears of joy, met his. "Exactly that." From the churchyard came Thomas's excited call. "Mama! Papa! Come see the cake! It has both our names on it!" "Mama?" Susan repeated wonderingly. "He's been practicing that for weeks, you know. In secret when he thought I couldn't hear. And Abigail has been rehearsing Papa with equal diligence," Josiah added with a smile. "They've been ready for this day perhaps longer than we have." Hand in hand, they moved toward the celebration, toward their children, their community, their future. Behind them, the church bells rang out once more, proclaiming Easter joy, resurrection hope, and love's triumph over loss. In years to come, the citizens of Redemption Springs would recall this day as the most joyful Easter in town. Memory. They would tell of butterflies dancing against a perfect blue sky, of children bubbling with excitement at becoming siblings, of a preacher who found the courage to love again, and a widow who opened her heart to new joy. But in this moment, as Josiah and Susan joined their waiting children at the center of the celebration, only the present existed, bright with promise, rich with blessing, and overflowing with the resurrection of love once thought forever lost. Epilogue. 1 year later, the garden behind the parsonage had transformed over the past year, much like the family who tended it. Where once sparse grass and a few hardy perennials had struggled, now neat beds of tulips, daffodils, and hyacinths created a patchwork of spring color. A white picket fence, erected by the men of the congregation during a Saturday work party, enclosed the cheerful domesticity within. Apple trees, their branches heavy with pink-white blossoms, stood sentinel at each corner, promising summer fruit and autumn harvest in the cycle of seasons to come. On this particular Easter Sunday, with morning services concluded and afternoon stretching golden before them, the Fletcher family gathered in their garden sanctuary. The air hung sweet with apple blossoms and freshly turned earth, while bees hummed industriously among the flowering bushes. From the church a short distance away came the muffled sounds of the congregation assembling for the Easter picnic, their voices carrying on the gentle breeze. Susan sat in the wooden rocking chair Josiah had crafted during the winter evenings, her face soft with contentment as she gazed down at the bundle cradled in her arms. The infant, barely 2 months old, slept peacefully, one tiny fist curled against her cheek. Downy hair, the color of butter in sunshine, peeked from beneath a delicately crocheted cap. "She looks like an angel," Abigail observed, leaning over to study her baby sister with undisguised adoration. At 9, Abigail had blossomed under the steady love of her new family, her solemn demeanor giving way to frequent smiles and occasional mischief. Her dark hair hung in 2 neat braids adorned with lavender ribbons that matched her Easter dress. "All babies look like angels when they're sleeping," Thomas countered with the worldly wisdom of his 5 years. "It's when they wake up hollering at midnight that they don't seem so angelic." "Thomas Fletcher," Susan admonished gently, though amusement danced in her eyes. "Your sister can't help needing midnight feedings." The boy shrugged good-naturedly. "I don't mind, really. Papa says Faith's strong lungs mean she'll be a fine singer in the church choir someday." At the mention of her name, the infant's eyes fluttered open, eyes the same cornflower blue as her father's. She regarded her assembled family with an unfocused gaze before her rosebud mouth opened in a perfect yawn. "Faith," Susan murmured, running a gentle finger along the baby's petal-soft cheek. "Our Easter blessing." The name had been Josiah's suggestion, conceived during those summer days when they'd first realized Susan was with child. "A testament to our faith in God's plan," he'd explained, "and to the season of her beginning." For Faith had been conceived during their Easter honeymoon journey to Denver. A precious new life begun even as they celebrated their new union. From his position, tending the garden gate, Josiah watched his family with quiet wonder. The past year had unfolded like a favorite psalm, rich with blessings, challenges overcome, and grace abundant beyond imagining. The transition from 2 separate households to one family had proceeded with surprising smoothness, the children adapting to their new roles as brother and sister with only occasional squabbles. Susan had transformed the bachelor parsonage into a true home, filling it with warmth, order, and the tantalizing aromas of home-cooked meals. And now, with Faith's arrival as winter yielded to spring, their family circle had expanded once more. Looking at his wife and 3 children in the dappled sunshine, Josiah felt gratitude swell within him, nearly too vast to contain. "Papa!" Thomas called, interrupting his contemplation. "Isn't it time for the egg hunt? The Wilson twins are already peeking through the fence." Indeed, 2 identical freckled faces peered hopefully over the pickets, their Sunday hats askew from apparent scrambling. Behind them, other children from the congregation gathered, drawn by Thomas's elaborate hints about specially decorated eggs and sugar prizes. "So they are," Josiah agreed, checking his pocket watch. "Abigail, is everything prepared?" The girl nodded importantly. "All the eggs are hidden. I made a map so we don't forget any." She patted the pocket of her pinafore where a carefully drawn diagram resided. "Very responsible," Josiah commended her. "You'll make a fine teacher someday with such attention to detail." Abigail beamed at the praise, standing a bit taller. Her dreams of becoming a school teacher had emerged during the past year, encouraged by both parents and the current schoolmistress who recognized the child's natural aptitude. "May we let them in now?" Thomas asked, fairly dancing with impatience. His role as co-organizer of the Easter egg hunt, a position he shared with Abigail, had occupied his thoughts for weeks. The siblings had spent hours decorating eggs with onion skin dyes and careful patterns, then creating inventive hiding places throughout the garden. At Josiah's nod, Thomas raced to the gate, throwing it wide with a flourish. "Welcome to the Easter hunt," he announced grandly. "Remember the rules. Little ones get the easy ones, big children look for the hard ones, and everybody gets 3 eggs only." A flood of children poured into the garden, ranging from toddlers barely steady on their feet to 10-year-olds who affected worldly disinterest despite their obvious excitement. The Wilson twins, 7-year-old terrors with hearts of gold, paused to bow formally to Susan before dashing toward the flower beds. "Happy Easter, Mrs. Fletcher! Congratulations on your beautiful baby," they chorused in what was clearly a rehearsed greeting. "Thank you, boys," Susan replied gravely, maintaining her composure despite the twinkle in her eye. "Mind the tulips, please. Mrs. Peabody would never forgive me if her prize bulbs were trampled." As if conjured by the mention of her name, Mrs. Peabody herself appeared at the garden gate, resplendent in a plum-colored dress with matching bonnet. A year of serving as unofficial grandmother to the Fletcher children had softened her once pinched expression, though she maintained her reputation for exacting standards in church matters. "Reverend Mrs. Fletcher," she greeted, making her way carefully along the garden path. "The ladies' aid has everything prepared for the picnic. When the children have finished their hunt, perhaps you'll join us?" "We wouldn't miss it," Josiah assured her, offering the older woman a seat on the wrought iron bench Josiah had traded a month of Sunday sermons to the blacksmith to acquire. Mrs. Peabody settled with a satisfied sigh, her gaze traveling appreciatively over the garden's transformation. "You've created a little paradise here," she observed. "Hard to believe what it looked like when you were a bachelor, Reverend." "The credit belongs entirely to my wife," Josiah replied, his voice warming as he glanced toward Susan. "She has a gift for bringing beauty where there was none." Susan looked up from the baby, catching his gaze. The look that passed between them spoke volumes, a private communication born of shared days and nights, joys and challenges. The intimate understanding that grew between two people committed to walking life's path together. The moment was interrupted by a triumphant shout from near the rain barrel, where young Billy Cooper held aloft a particularly large egg decorated with stripes and spots. "Found one," he crowed, "and it was real hard." Whoa. His discovery triggered a flurry of renewed searching activity. Thomas and Abigail moved among the younger children, offering hints and guidance with impressive patience. "Look a little higher, Mary." "No, Peter, that's a rock, not an egg." "Yes, Susanna, check under the bed." Soon the garden resounded with delighted discoveries, and the occasional disappointed sigh when a promising hiding place yielded nothing. Amid the controlled chaos, Susan rose carefully from her rocker, adjusting Faith against her shoulder. "She's getting warm," she explained, moving toward the dappled shade beneath the largest apple tree. "The sunshine is a bit strong for such a little one." Josiah followed, leaving Mrs. Peabody happily supervising the hunt with occasional directives about appropriate search methods. Beneath the spreading branches of the apple tree, with petals occasionally drifting down like fragrant snow, he and Susan created a small island of tranquility. "It's been quite a year," Susan observed softly, as Josiah ran a gentle finger along Faith's tiny hand. They instinctively grasped his finger, her grip surprisingly strong for one so small. "Indeed it has," he agreed. "When I think of last Easter, the sermon mix-up chasing you through town." Susan's laugh, low and warm, blended with the garden sounds. "Who could have imagined we'd be standing here a year later with 3 children and more happiness than seems possible for one family?" "God could," Josiah said simply. "His plans often surprise us, but they're always better than what we might have designed ourselves." Around them, the egg hunt was concluding, each child proudly clutching their allowance of 3 eggs. Thomas and Abigail distributed sugar candies from a basket, rewards for participation regardless of egg-finding success. Their natural leadership and kindness filled Josiah with pride. "Children," he called, "before we join the picnic, shall we offer our Easter prayer?" Without hesitation, Thomas and Abigail abandoned their candy distribution, hurrying to join their parents beneath the apple tree. The children from the congregation, recognizing a familiar ritual, quieted respectfully, some bowing their heads without prompting. The Fletcher family formed a circle, with Thomas and Abigail each taking one of Josiah's hands, Abigail gently clasping her mother's free hand while Susan cradled Faith. The physical connection, this literal family circle, had become their custom in recent months, a tangible expression of their unity. Heavenly Father, Josiah began, his deep voice carrying in the garden's hush. On this Easter Sunday, we thank you for the gift of resurrection, not only Christ's triumph over death, but the smaller resurrections you grant us in this life. We thank you for bringing beauty from ashes, joy from sorrow, and new beginnings from what seemed to be endings. He paused, momentarily overcome by the fullness of his heart as he looked at the family joined in prayer. Susan with her quiet strength, Abigail with her thoughtful compassion, Thomas with his boundless enthusiasm, and tiny Faith, embodiment of their hope for the future. We thank you, he continued, for the family you have woven together from separate threads, creating a tapestry more beautiful than we could have imagined. Help us to honor the past while embracing the future, to cherish memories while creating new ones, and to always recognize your hand in the journey that brought us here. And thank you for baby Faith, Thomas added earnestly, even though she cries at night. A ripple of gentle laughter passed through the assembled children. Josiah squeezed his son's hand affectionately before concluding, "May we live each day in gratitude for second chances and the endless possibility of love resurrected. Amen." "Amen," echoed the children before scattering toward the gate, eager for the promised picnic. Mrs. Peabody rose from her bench, brushing invisible wrinkles from her skirts. "I'll herd these little lambs toward the church," she offered. "Take your time joining us. The guest of honor is entitled to a grand entrance." She nodded toward baby Faith before shepherding the last stragglers through the gate. As the garden emptied, Thomas and Abigail lingered, clearly torn between joining their friends and remaining with their family. "You may go ahead," Susan told them, recognizing their dilemma. "Save places at the table for us. We'll be along shortly." Needing no further permission, the children dashed toward the gate, their excitement palpable. At the threshold, however, Abigail paused, turning back with a thoughtful expression. "Mama, Papa, I've been thinking about something." "What is it, sweetheart?" Josiah encouraged. The girl fidgeted with her pinafore pocket, suddenly shy. "Well, I was wondering, since Faith is named for when she was made, and Easter means resurrection and new life, does that mean I can say our whole family got resurrected, like Jesus did?" The theological question, delivered with a child's direct innocence, touched Josiah deeply. "That's very insightful, Abigail," he said. "In a way, yes. God took 4 people who had experienced great loss and created something new and beautiful from what remained, not replacing what came before, but transforming it into something just as precious." Appearing satisfied with this answer, Abigail nodded. "That's what I thought. Like the butterflies from our wedding." With that profound observation, she rejoined Thomas at the gate, and the siblings raced toward the church, their voices fading as they rounded the corner. Through the open gate, Josiah could see the church, its doors flung wide in welcome. Tables, arranged on the lawn, overflowed with Easter delicacies. The congregation mingled in their Sunday finest, children darting between adults, laughter carrying on the spring breeze. The scene embodied everything he loved about Redemption Springs: its sense of community, its resilience, its capacity for joy. "They're remarkable children," Susan observed, following his gaze toward the departing siblings. "Both of them so thoughtful in their different ways." "They take after their mother in that regard," Josiah replied, turning back to his wife and infant daughter. Susan smiled, shifting Faith to her other shoulder. "I'd say they have plenty of their father in them as well. Thomas has your expressive eyes, and Abigail has adopted your habit of quoting scripture at opportune moments. A family trait, then," Josiah concluded, "passed down not through blood but through love." A comfortable silence settled between them, filled with the garden sounds of buzzing bees, rustling leaves, and distant church bells calling the faithful to celebration. Faith drowsed against her mother's shoulder, her tiny rosebud mouth working in sleep, as if dreaming of her next meal. Josiah stepped closer, drawn by the perfect tableau of his wife and daughter beneath the flowering apple tree. Petals drifted down, landing in Susan's chestnut hair like natural adornments. One settled on Faith's cap, a delicate pink against the cream-colored yarn. "You look like a Madonna and child," he observed softly, a vision of motherhood. Susan's cheeks colored prettily at the comparison. A year of marriage had not diminished his ability to bring a blush to her face with well-chosen words. "Hardly a Madonna," she demurred. "Just a frontier preacher's wife with a baby and dinner rolls waiting to be served at the picnic." "You are far more than that, Susan Fletcher," Josiah countered, his voice low with emotion. "You are the answer to prayers I didn't know how to formulate, the blessing I didn't dare request." He reached out, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear in a gesture reminiscent of their moment in the cemetery a year before. "You restored laughter to this household. You gave Thomas a mother's love when he needed it most. You made room in your heart for a ready-made family, even while carrying the memory of your first love." Susan's eyes glistened with emotion. "As you did for me and Abigail," she reminded him. "The generosity was mutual, Josiah." "Then we are mutually blessed," he concluded, leaning forward to press a tender kiss to her forehead, mindful of the sleeping infant between them. Faith stirred, blinking up at her parents with unfocused blue eyes before settling back to sleep. The complete trust in that gaze, the innocent certainty that she was safe, loved, protected, encapsulated everything the past year had built. From the church came the sound of the choir beginning an Easter hymn, their voices carrying clear and joyful through the afternoon air. The melody floated into the garden, wrapping around the small family like a benediction. "We should join the others," Susan suggested, though she made no move to leave their sheltered spot beneath the apple tree. "In a moment," Josiah murmured. Then, unable to resist, he leaned forward again, this time finding his wife's lips in a kiss that spoke of tenderness and passion in equal measure. A husband's kiss, intimate yet reverent. As they drew apart, a giggle erupted from the garden gate. Thomas and Abigail stood watching, hands clasped over their mouths in a futile attempt to stifle their amusement. "Papa's kissing Mama again," Thomas stage whispered to his sister. "They do that a lot," Abigail replied, with the wise resignation of an older child. Caught in this display of affection, Josiah felt laughter bubble up from his chest rather than embarrassment. "Indeed we do," he confirmed, slipping an arm around Susan's waist. "And I intend to continue the practice for many years to come." Eh, Thomas commented, though his grin belied any genuine disgust. "I think it's romantic," Abigail countered, ever the more sentimental of the siblings. "Like in the storybooks where the prince and princess live happily ever after." "Better than any storybook," Josiah assured her, guiding his family toward the gate. "Because our story is real, with all its complications and imperfections, and all the more precious for being so." As they passed through the garden gate, Faith awakened fully, her tiny face screwing up in preparation for a cry that would announce her hunger to the entire gathering. Susan expertly adjusted her position, murmuring soothing nonsense until the infant settled. The church bells rang out once more, their joyful pealing echoing across Redemption Springs. Nestled in the valley below, the town gleamed in the afternoon sunlight, a community that had welcomed, supported, occasionally gossiped about, but ultimately celebrated the family, now making its way to the Easter picnic. With Thomas and Abigail skipping ahead, Faith contentedly nestled against Susan's shoulder, and his arm securely around his wife's waist. Josiah Fletcher offered a silent prayer of gratitude for this resurrection of love, this second chance more precious than gold. This family forged not despite past sorrows, but because those very losses had prepared their hearts to recognize joy when it appeared in unexpected form. Above them, apple blossoms drifted on the spring breeze like nature's own confetti, celebrating renewal, resurrection, and the endless possibility of beginning again.